Chapter 735. Li Yundong looked at the bank check in the gold card with a strange look in his eyes. There was an Arabic number 1 on it, followed by a series of OS, which made people really jealous and dazzled. Asterisk 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 asterisk, as the saying goes, money moves people's hearts. Even a great cultivator like Li Yundong couldn't help but feel his heart beat faster when he suddenly saw such a long series of numbers. Dharma, wealth, companions, and earthly treasures. Money was not omnipotent, but without money, it was absolutely impossible. He had just boasted that he would open Desanxian all over the world, and now someone had come to give him money. Even if he wanted to doze off, there was no need to give him a pillow like this, right? This was too strange. Although this series of zeros was the unit of measurement of Japanese yen, such a long series of numbers was scary even in Japanese. This Sasaki group is too rich. Why did they rush over to give me money? They have too much money to spend, so they want me to help them spend it? Although Li Yundong's face was still calm for a moment, he felt strange in his heart. He didn't know whether he should accept the money or not. Seeing his expression, Ziyuan, who was standing to one side, smiled and said in a low voice, "What's wrong? You don't dare to accept it? This is actually very normal. As far as I know, many rich businessmen and officials have gone to the temple to burn incense. They burn 600,000 merit incense every month. In this way, you know how powerful it is." Li Yundong turned to look at her, smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, "If it were you, would you dare to accept it?" Ziyuan thought for a moment, shook her head gently and said in a low voice, "This money is hot. I don't dare to accept it." Li Yundong also had a plan in an instant and secretly agreed with Ziyuan in his heart. If this money had been given by Shen Wankai or Chris, Li Yundong might have been thick-skinned enough to accept it. But who had given it? Yamaguchi Gumi. It was at least one of the top 5 underworld forces in the world. If he dared to accept this kind of money, his guts must be boundlessly plump. Even if he had 100 mouths to explain that he had nothing to do with Yamaguchi Gumi in the future, the higher-ups would not believe him no matter what he said. He had always kept a low profile. If he were to accept this money, he would really be afraid that the higher-ups would not look for him for tea and chat. He was tired of living. He wasn't afraid, but the problem was that because of this small amount of money, he would be targeted by the higher-ups from now on. That was definitely not worth it. As the saying goes, don't be afraid of a thief stealing, but be afraid of a thief remembering. If there was always a pair of eyes staring at you from behind, how could you live? Of course he could run away if he wanted to, but what about Su Chan? What about the Fox Zen school? What about Ziyuan? What about her Lingong sect? What about Feng Na and Qingqing? What about their families? Taking 10,000 steps back, even if he was bold enough to accept the money, what would the cultivators of the other sects think of him if word of this got out? Would someone use this as an excuse to poke him in the back and say that he was a traitor who colluded with outsiders? Although this matter was a little extreme, there had never been a lack of such patriotic people in China, especially when there was an economic dispute with Yamaguchi Gumi. It was really like mud falling in one's pants. Even if it was not shit, it was shit. Li Yundong didn't know that the Japanese underworld had always had a good tradition of donating to the forces of Buddhism. As long as it was not discovered, the disciples of Buddhism would always accept it with a smile. After thinking for a while, he pushed the golden invitation back and said very seriously, "I don't accept a reward without doing anything. Even if I am the reincarnation of Wisdom King, I can't accept this gift from you for no reason." Seeing that Li Yundong had refused him, but he couldn't understand what he had said, Nishikuharu was very anxious. He immediately turned his head and waved at a little brother behind him, who was black from head to toe. The little brother immediately got up from the ground and trotted over to him. After Nishikuharu asked him a few questions, the little brother quickly translated what Li Yundong had said before. Nishikuharu immediately said a few more words, and the little brother raised his head and said to Li Yundong, "The wise king, our team leader said that this is the incense money they donated. It's all very clean money, which represents our sincerity and sincerity. Moreover, the people who came this time are all members with clean identities. There won't be any disputes. Please accept it, the wise king." Li Yundong shook his head like a rattle drum. "No, this is a tea house, not a temple. How can I accept incense money? I'll accept your kindness, but I can't accept this money." Nishikuharu saw that Li Yundong had refused so decisively, and he was very disappointed. For a moment, he couldn't help but lower his head with a depressed expression. However, the little brother next to him was a little clever. He whispered something to him, and Nishikuharu was immediately overjoyed. He gave him a look of appreciation, but the little brother looked as if he had eaten a ginseng fruit, and all his bones became lighter. Nishikuharu looked at Li Yundong eagerly and said, "The wise king, if you don't accept our donation, then at least, let us drink a few cups of tea and burn a few sticks of incense, right?" After listening to Ziyuan's translation, Li Yundong hesitated for a moment. Although he didn't like the Japanese people's behavior of flattering and bullying, as the saying went, one should not hit a smiling person. Nishikuharu in front of him should be considered a great figure in the local area. Now that he was carefully smiling at him, even if he was 100 times unwilling, he couldn't say it out loud. Li Yundong thought for a moment and thought to himself, it shouldn't be a big deal to come in and have a cup of tea, right? He has come from afar. Although he is a gangster, his heart is at least devout. I can't just close the door and go back and say that I'm not broad-minded, can I? Thinking of this, Li Yundong nodded gently, agreeing with Nishikuharu's words. He turned his head and whispered a few words to the little foxes beside him, asking them to prepare the tea set and boil the water to make tea to receive the guests. When the little foxes saw their sect leader being worshipped like a god, they felt an indescribable sense of pride. They turned their heads to look at Hanzhen and Jim, who had long been dumbstruck, and then hurried off to do their work. Hanzhen and Jim saw Nishikuharu waving his hand and saying a few words. The underlings who were kneeling at the entrance and blocking the pedestrian street all stood up and rushed into the Desangxian tea house. The tea house was filled to the brim with people. Even Nishikuharu himself did not have a seat to sit on. He could not help but glance at Hanzhen and Jim. He tried to speak to them in very awkward English. "Can I sit here and drink tea with you guys?" He thought that these two people were Li Yundong's friends, so he was very polite and didn't dare to offend them. After he finished speaking, Jim didn't mind, but Hanzhen's expression suddenly became very interesting. Jim's family was a righteous one, and he himself was a simple-minded playboy. He didn't have a deep understanding of the power of the Yamaguchi-gumi, but Hanzhen's family was in the underworld. How could he not know the famous Yamaguchi-gumi? Although his family was also in the underworld, compared with the Yamaguchi-gumi, those people in his family were really a group of good men and women who ate vegetarian and prayed to Buddha. They couldn't wait to ask Washington and the United Nations for a Peace Friendship Award to match their status. Although he was only the leader of the Sasaki group in Osaka, he didn't dare to offend him easily. If an ordinary person wanted to sit down with him at the same table, he might have kicked him out. But now that Nishikuharu wanted to sit down, how could he dare to stop him? Nishikuharu saw that he forced a smile and politely asked him to sit down, so he felt relieved and looked at Li Yundong again. Seeing that Li Yundong didn't want his donation, Nishikuharu was tempted to drink tea. "You don't want my money? Well, you're doing business anyway. I'll drink the most expensive tea. I'll order 10 cups in one go and pour 9 cups after 1 cup. You can't control me, can you? Now it's not considered a bribe, is it?" With this idea in mind, Nishikuharu waved his hand and asked his subordinates to relax a little. This time the subordinates suddenly cheered. Although most of them were rough people and didn't understand elegant things like tea art, this tea was extraordinary. This was tea made in the tea shop opened by the Akalanatha. Could an ordinary person drink it? Although it was not made by the Akalanatha himself, it was not ordinary tea. These subordinates all ordered the most expensive tea, and in an instant they ordered all the good Huangshan Maojian tea in the store. Ziyuan watched from the side as these uncouth men chewed peonies and commented on the quality of the tea. She didn't know whether to cry or laugh. At this time, Li Yundong also knew what the other party was up to. When he saw the little foxes running over to tell him that the good tea had been ordered by these guys and asking him what to do, he immediately had an idea and said in a low voice, "It's simple. Sell the rest of the tea to them at the highest price. If they want to give me money for free, I really don't dare to accept it, but if they want to take advantage of me and give me money for doing business, would I still refuse the money if I was out of my mind? Go, go, go. Anyway, these guys can't drink it." The little foxes were all overjoyed. One by one they laughed so hard that their noses and eyes couldn't be seen. When Feng Na, Ching Ching and Chris, who had rushed over, saw this scene, they were all speechless and smiled bitterly. Previously, when the members of the Sasaki group had knelt outside the pedestrian street, the surrounding tourists had seen a lot of Western scenery. Some people were very curious and looked at Desangxian. They didn't understand the origin of this shop and why it was like this. It seemed like a show. When one of the men passed by, he heard the people around him talking about it. His heart skipped a beat and he wanted to join in the fun and go in to drink some tea. However, a man who was walking with him tried to persuade him. "Old Zhang, don't go. This is a scam. I went there once before and I almost lost my pants. This shop is very black. Don't go there. The man who had spoken was none other than the man who had been tricked by Su Chan and the little fox in the Desangxian tea shop and almost knelt on the washboard. Today he happened to pass by here with his friends, only to see that there were many people watching the fun. They had wanted to go forward and watch the fun, but they hadn't expected that their companion would want to walk into the trap. In desperation he had to tell Lao Zhang what had happened. However, unexpectedly, his words aroused Lao Zhang's burning sense of justice. He said with a righteous face, "Are you kidding me? In this bright world, how could there be such a black shop in broad daylight? Is this still the world of the party? Are we still living under the red flag? I don't believe that they dare to trick me in front of so many people." As he spoke, he ignored the man's dissuasion, pushed through the crowd and swaggered toward Desangxian. Lao Zhang stepped into the Desangxian. Without even looking at it, he shouted, "I want to." Before he could finish his words, he suddenly saw that the Desangxian tea house was full of people. These people were all wearing black sunglasses, black suits, black trousers and black leather shoes. They were dressed as if they were afraid that others would not know that they were gangsters. Moreover, most of them were rough people. Some of them drank tea for a while and couldn't help but become unrestrained. As soon as they took off their clothes, they revealed dense and terrifying tattoos. It was really scary. It was also because Li Yundong was here that these gangsters did not dare to make a loud noise. They just whispered. For a moment, there was only a buzzing sound in the tea house. But when Lao Zhang roared, the buzzing sound suddenly stopped. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the man standing at the door. So many gangsters stopped talking at the same time. Their power was really scary. Lao Zhang's voice at the door was immediately stuck in his throat, as if he was a duck being grabbed by the neck. His back was covered with a layer of cold sweat. Without saying a word, he turned around and ran away. He rushed out of the Desangxian tea house and rushed to his friend. With a pale face he said, "You're right. This tea house is 2F** King evil. It's not an ordinary kind of evil. Let's go. We can't afford to offend them, but we can hide." After that, the two of them left as if they were fleeing. Li Yundong watched the man named Lao Zhang suddenly appear and then suddenly run away in fear. His heart suddenly moved and he couldn't help but complain. He wanted to cry but had no tears. It's over. Who dares to come here to drink tea in the future? In the eyes of others, my Desangxian tea house is probably a gangster tea house, right? Except for gangsters, no one will dare to come in the future, will they? Alas, one mistake can cause everlasting regret. I really shouldn't have been soft-hearted and let these Japanese people in to drink tea. Now, I was greedy for a small advantage, but I lost a lot in the end. Li Yundong was in pain, but Nishikyu, who was beside him, suddenly said something to Li Yundong. As soon as he finished speaking, Ziyuan's expression suddenly became very interesting. Li Yundong asked curiously, "Ziyuan, what did he say?" Ziyuan smiled faintly and looked at Li Yundong with a strange look in her eyes. He said, "Are you interested in opening this tea house in Wakayama County?" Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Well, I was just wondering if Desangxian would become a professional gathering place for gangsters. You just said something like that. Do you really want to turn my tea house into a gangster chain tea house?" Chapter 736. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry at Nishikyu words, but Hanjin was even more shocked. For God's sake, he had just made a bet with this guy, saying that if his tea house could be opened all over the world, he would be the President of the United States. As a result, someone from the Yamaguchi-gumi immediately ran over and cried, asking this guy to open the tea house in Japan. Although it was only Wakayama Prefecture, in Hanjin's opinion, if the Yamaguchi-gumi really helped him, it would be a matter of minutes to open the tea house all over Japan or even all of Southeast Asia. When the tea house opened to a certain number and accumulated a certain amount of funds and fame, it would definitely not be a joke to go global. Thinking of this, Hanjin's eyes kept turning, and his eyes were full of depression and doubt. The current situation was too coincidental. It was like a trap waiting for him. As soon as he jumped into it, the other party tightened the trap. "You can't trick me like this." In Hanjin's opinion, if he were to encounter such a thing, he would probably laugh so hard that he would wake up in his dreams. There was no need to hesitate, so he quickly agreed. However, Hanjin was a gangster himself, so he regarded everyone else as gangsters. It was like some people were like maggots, but they regarded the whole world as a big manure tank. In Li Yundong's opinion, although Nishikyu proposal was a little tempting, and it was very timely, the identity of this guy was really inappropriate. If Li Yundong had any financial dealings with this group of guys, it would really be a stain that he would never be able to clear up in the future. Li Yundong thought for a moment and flatly refused Nishikyu proposal. Han Zhen, who was watching from the side, was shocked and anxious. He wanted to grab Li Yundong and scold him for being a fool. He would rather offend the Yamaguchi-gumi than seize such a good opportunity. However, Nishikyu Haruo only revealed a disappointed expression and did not feel offended. Of course, if it had been an ordinary person in front of him, Nishikyu Haruo would have immediately turned hostile and roared with a ferocious face, "Fuck, I gave you face but you don't want it. Someone drag him out and kill him." However, the person in front of him didn't dare to do so. He didn't even dare to think about it. In his opinion, it was normal for the reincarnated immovable wisdom king to reject him so coldly. However, he didn't dare to do anything except drink some tea during this trip, which made this senior Buddhist believer feel a little embarrassed. He was unwilling to go back like this, so he tentatively asked Li Yundong, "Please ask the wise king if I can burn incense here." After listening to Ziyuan's translation, Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He wanted to refuse, he wanted to laugh. He wanted to refuse, but Ziyuan winked at him as if she wanted him to help. Li Yundong had a deep trust in Ziyuan. His heart skipped a beat and he changed his words. "Okay, but I don't have any incense burners, merit incense or god statues here. Even if you want to offer incense, you don't have any conditions." Unexpectedly, after Nishikyu heard the translation from his underling, he grinned and clapped his hands. Like magic, his underlings behind him conjured a wooden statue of the immovable wisdom king and an antique incense burner. Then these experienced mafias took out 3 joss sticks from their backs in unison. Although Li Yundong was also a great cultivator with great magical powers, he couldn't help but be a little stunned when he saw this scene. He thought to himself, "Oh my god, it seems that they are all ready. Amazing, truly amazing." He just didn't know whether these guys brought these from Japan or bought them locally. If it was brought over from Japan, wouldn't that be too exaggerated? However, even if it was bought locally, wasn't it a little too thorough? Was there a need to be so pious? "Brother, are you part of the underworld or not? Why do you look more pious than those guys from Jinyan Tantrism?" But these words were hidden in Li Yundong's heart, and he didn't ask them out loud. Although he also cultivated Buddhist mental cultivation methods, he didn't understand the fatality connection and the mind connection, so he could only hide these questions in the depths of his heart. At this time, everyone in the Desangxian tea house was stunned to see the group of black-clothed men respectfully place the statue of the immovable wisdom king on the tea table in the middle of the tea house hall, and then put an incense burner in front of the wooden statue. Nishikyu took the lead in offering incense, and then the underlings behind him lined up in a long snake formation, quietly waiting to offer incense and pay their respects. Japanese people were rigid and law-abiding. Whether it was in society, in the company or at home, all kinds of rules were very strict. Among them, the rules of the underworld were even more astonishing and particularly cruel. These black-clothed men said that they would line up in one line, but they would never line up in two. Moreover, none of them whispered to each other. Everyone lined up honestly according to their seniority. The line went all the way to the pedestrian street, blocking the intersection again. But when a passerby said that they were going to pass by, they didn't do anything to bully others. Instead, they honestly made way for them. When they passed by, they returned to the formation. Among them, there were those who had finished offering incense. They went to the side and stood with their hands crossed in front of them. Their eyes were focused on their noses were focused on their hearts, and their eyes were focused on their hearts. Li Yundong watched them take turns to offer incense with candles in their hands, and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He turned his head and saw that Ziyuan was secretly laughing. He couldn't help glaring at her and whispering, "Hey, are you making fun of me?" Ziyuan smiled and was about to speak when she saw Ching Ching tugging at his sleeve and saying, "Hey Li Yundong, are they worshipping you?" Ching Ching was from an ordinary family. Looking at the scene in front of her, she felt like she was in a dream. She looked at the murderous black-clothed men taking turns to offer incense. She didn't dare to speak loudly and kept her voice low, as if she was afraid of alarming these gangsters. Li Yundong said with a wry smile, "It seems that they are worshipping me." At this time, Feng Na also came to her senses a little. She was dumbfounded. She couldn't help looking at Li Yundong as if she had seen a Namekian. She covered her mouth and whispered, "No way, you're not dead yet." This sentence immediately made Ziyuan burst out laughing. The usually dignified and elegant fairy also found herself so indecent. For a moment she turned her head away, her shoulders shaking. The little foxes couldn't help but turn their heads and run to the warehouse at the back. As soon as they rushed in, they all burst out laughing. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I'm not dead yet, but I think I'm about to die from their worship." Feng Na didn't think it was funny. She said, "They seem to be worshipping the immovable wisdom king? What does that have to do with you? You, who the hell are you?" Li Yundong's face turned serious. "Actually, I am the legendary Martian. Earthlings, you should wake up." Feng Na was stunned and the corner of her mouth twitched. It seemed that she wanted to laugh, but in the end she didn't. Instead, she sighed sadly in her heart. "In the end, he refused to tell me these things." However, Ching Cheng, who was standing to one side, laughed heartlessly and said, "Hey Martian, be careful. Be careful that Ultraman comes to make trouble for you." As she said this, she pointed to the Japanese who were burning incense. Li Yundong also glanced at them, only to see that although the Japanese had heard their whispers and laughter, none of them had turned their heads to look at them. They looked solemn and respectful, which really made people feel a little respectful. Li Yundong waved his hand at Feng Na and Ching Cheng and said, "Forget it, don't make trouble. They are worshipping me and I, the master, am laughing on the side. It's not like a human being. It's really inappropriate, isn't it?" His words were serious, but when they thought about it, it was really strange and funny. Feng Na and Ching Cheng both covered their mouths and laughed. At this time, more and more people gathered outside the Desanxian. Many people looked inside curiously, as if they didn't understand why this group of black-clothed people were burning incense and worshipping the gods here so devoutly and solemnly. For a moment they were all guessing and talking about it. Li Yundong saw that these Japanese people were burning incense in turn as if there was no one else around. He suddenly said to Ziyuan in a low voice with some embarrassment, "Hey, in the future will my Desanxian become the hall of these guys? Isn't this too exaggerated?" Ziyuan pursed her lips and smiled, but didn't answer his question. Instead, she turned to Feng Na and Ching Cheng and whispered, "How much was the turnover just now?" Ching Cheng immediately ran to the counter and took a look. Her eyes suddenly widened. She trotted over and said in a slightly trembling voice, 1,380,000. Feng Na suddenly sucked in a breath of cold air. She knew that this group of Yamaguchi-kun must have earned a lot from this tea, but she didn't expect that they would give away so much money. Li Yundong was also speechless for a moment. When he had opened this tea shop, he had aimed at high-level people, but he hadn't expected that it would be such a high-end method. This was really a case of not opening for 3 months but opening for 3 years. Of course, this was also due to Li Yundong's ruthlessness just now. Whether it was bad tea or bad tea, he had sold it to these guys at a sky-high price. Otherwise, these people wouldn't have been able to drink so much money even if they broke their stomachs. After all, Feng Na and Ching Cheng had not seen much of the world. Suddenly seeing so much money, their mouths were dry, their eyes were hot, their hearts were beating fast and their voices were trembling. They were even more flustered. Ever since Feng Na had resigned from the position of president of the student union of the school, she had wanted to help Li Yundong take care of the tea shop, so she had put almost all her effort into it. Although she was surprised, she soon thought of something and whispered to Li Yundong, "Li Yundong, this money, can you accept it?" As she spoke, she looked at these gangsters worriedly as if saying, "These guys are not good people at first glance. Will they go back on their word?" At this time, Li Yundong laughed and said, "Don't worry, they won't go back on their word." Feng Na was relieved. She looked at the Japanese people who were taking turns to offer incense and said in a low voice, "Li Yundong, why didn't you agree to open a tea house with them just now? Do you think their background is not good?" Li Yundong glanced at the Japanese people in the hall and said with a wry smile, "Do you want Desanxian to become the Zhonghua branch of Yamaguchi-gumi or the Tonko branch of Tianan City in the future?" Feng Na couldn't help laughing. She said in a low voice, "It doesn't matter if they don't cooperate, but I have a good way to make a lot of money." Chapter 737. When Li Yundong heard Feng Na's words, he immediately laughed. Although his cultivation was high now, he was not very interested in fame and fortune. However, at the moment, a large group of people were living with him. He had to let them live a good life with him. Otherwise, they would have to live a hard life in the future. No matter how good he was at fighting, it would be useless. Soon. It wouldn't have mattered if he was alone, but every woman around him was a great beauty. Even Ching Ching was a pretty big girl, not to mention the others. With such a group of enchanting beauties following him, not to mention jewelry, clothing, food, housing and transportation, he had to keep up with them. Otherwise, when beauties like Su Chan, Ziyuan and Zhou Qin went out, what they were wearing were street stalls. What would that be like? Even if they were willing to wear them, he couldn't bear to look at them. Therefore, even if Li Yundong had enemies all over the world, he had no hatred for the word money. Li Yundong asked with a smile, "What, do you have a good idea?" Feng Na chuckled, quietly pointed at Nishikuharu and said in a low voice, "It's very simple. The wool comes from the sheep." Li Yundong was stunned for a moment. He understood a little but he couldn't believe it. He stared at her in disbelief and said, "You mean?" Feng Na smiled and said, "I know you are a gentleman and are embarrassed to say such things, so don't listen to my idea. I'll tell Ziyuan." As she said this, she turned her head and whispered a few words to Ziyuan. However, with Li Yundong's cultivation, how could he not hear what she said? When he heard it, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Feng Na whispered to Ziyuan to tell the Japanese to leave the wooden statue and the incense burner here and not take them away. Although these words seemed to have no head or tail, the meaning behind them was very memorable. The other party had brought an incense burner and a wooden statue, but they wouldn't let anyone take them away. What did they mean? It was very simple. They could keep it for future use. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It seemed that Feng Na was ready to do business with him again. Feng Na's idea was simple. It was nothing more than using Li Yundong as a shield. Logically speaking, this idea of hers was a little whimsical, so she didn't go into detail about it. It was clear that this fresh graduate was quite a scheming person, especially at a time like this. His quick-wittedness and quick reflexes were commendable. Given time, he might even become a capable person in the business world. Feng Na's idea was very simple, and it was obvious that Li Yundong's idea was rather whimsical. Soon after Feng Na finished speaking to Ziyuan, she looked at her with sparkling eyes. In the depths of Feng Na's heart, she had long been envious and in awe of Ziyuan. When she first saw her, she was completely overwhelmed by this woman. No matter how she compared herself, she couldn't find any way to surpass her. This really made Feng Na discouraged. In Feng Na's opinion, compared to Zhou Qin and Su Chan, she also had her own strengths. However, in front of Ziyuan, she felt that the other party was unfathomable and unfathomable. She didn't dare to show the slightest bit of disrespect. Therefore, Feng Na secretly looked at Ziyuan anxiously, for fear that she would frown and say something bad. After hearing this, Ziyuan looked at Feng Na in surprise, and then smiled at Li Yundong. "You found a good manager." Feng Na was overjoyed, and her heart that had jumped to her throat immediately calmed down. Li Yundong smiled bitterly and said, "You too. Forget it, I don't care. You guys do what you want." Ching Ching, who was standing to one side, spoke up for her best friend. "Hey Li Yundong, that's not very kind of you. We help you take care of this shop. We do all the purchasing and accounting. We're so tired that we don't even have time to sleep at night. It's fine if you just leave everything to us, but how can you say such sarcastic words? You can't be like this." Feng Na was very anxious when she heard this. She quickly pulled Ching Ching aside and whispered, "Hey, stop talking." However, Li Yundong's expression changed. He pretended to bow with his hands in front of his chest and said, "You two great talents, I'm sorry for being impolite." His behavior immediately made Feng Na and Ching Ching laugh. Ching Ching smiled and said, "Well, I thought that now that you have become a big shot, you don't care about us small people anymore." Feng Na glanced at Ching Ching and said in a low voice, "You really measure the heart of a gentleman with your own mean measure. Li Yundong is not such a person." As she spoke, she glanced at Li Yundong. Suddenly, she felt that the hothead who had shattered a boulder on his chest back at school was gone. The one standing before her was a mature, yet ridiculously young man. He was looking at her with a smile. Although she still couldn't figure out who he was, the background and power that he had displayed made her tremble in awe. But the more she thought about it, the more precious Li Yundong's unpretentious and easygoing attitude became. This was especially so when she saw this mesmerizing boy in front of her. When he smiled, it was as if there was a layer of light around him that made people unable to look at him directly. If they looked at him for too long, their hearts would beat wildly. For a moment, Feng Na's heart skipped a beat. She could no longer associate this man with the boy she had met at school. Feng Na was dazed for a moment. Ching Ching coughed dryly, which brought Feng Na back to her senses. Her cheeks turned crimson, and she hurriedly lowered her head to hide her embarrassment and shyness by tucking her ears behind her ear. Li Yundong noticed that this senior of his, who used to have a sense of chivalry and shrewdness, was now acting like a pretty girl from a humble family. Her shyness when she lowered her head added a touch of charm to the round-faced beauty. Ching Ching, who was standing to one side, saw all of this. She raised her eyebrows and looked at Feng Na playfully. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something that would make Feng Na want to tear her mouth apart. Fortunately, before she could say anything, Li Yundong laughed and said, "Feng Na, Ching Ching, you two can do whatever you want. Since this shop is handed over to you, you can do whatever you want. I trust you." At the end of the year, I will reward you according to your contributions. As Li Yundong spoke, he casually patted Feng Na's shoulder. Although this action was nothing special in the eyes of others, Feng Na's heart suddenly skipped a beat. She felt as if her shoulder had become a little numb and soft. Ziyuan, who was standing to one side, sighed in her heart when she saw Feng Na's lustful look. She shook her head and said, "It's really a pity that Yundong is always like this. What will happen to this guy in the future? How many girls will he hurt?" However, Ziyuan also knew that she was also in a mess, so she didn't have the leisure to care about others. She quickly restrained her thoughts and said to Li Yundong, "Li Yundong, they've finished burning incense and are waiting for you." Li Yundong turned his head and took a look. Sure enough, he saw Nishikuharu and the others standing respectfully in the hall, as orderly as soldiers waiting for their officers to inspect them. Li Yundong nodded to Ziyuan and motioned for her to follow him. Ziyuan smiled slightly, indicating that she understood, and followed him. Nishikuharu had seen Li Yundong, Ziyuan, Feng Na, and the others laughing and talking about something. He also knew his identity, so he didn't go up to join in the fun. He waited obediently for Li Yundong. If Li Yundong said that he would wait for a few hours, he would probably wait here for a few hours. Although the leader of the Sasaki group was not a devil who could stop children from crying in Wakayama County, he was definitely a cruel and merciless person who killed people without blinking an eye. Except for his own boss, he was only so respectful in front of Li Yundong. If it were his enemies, they would probably not believe that the famous Nishikuharu in Wakayama County would be as docile as a kitten. When Nishikuharu saw Li Yundong coming up, he quickly took 2 steps forward and said a few words. Ziyuan told Li Yundong that the Japanese wanted to pay the bill, but they expected that it would cost a lot of money. They didn't have so much cash on them, and the checks in their hands couldn't be broken to pay the bill, so they wanted to ask someone to go with them to the bank. Li Yundong nodded and glanced at Feng Na and Ching Ching, asking them with his eyes which one of them was going to go. Ching Ching raised her hand without thinking and said, I'll go. Immediately, a little fox jumped up and raised her hand, joining in the fun. Feng Na was amused and annoyed at the same time. She tugged at her and said in a low voice, Hey, these are all gangsters. Do you dare to go? Ching Ching smiled and said, I didn't dare before, but now don't you see who is standing behind me? He is a big shot who makes these gangsters kneel down and kowtow to him. Don't worry, I'm not afraid. With that, she casually stepped forward and curiously looked at the scar on Nishikuharu's face and the tattoo on his neck with a pair of black eyes. Nishikuharu looked at her and grinned, trying to get close to her. However, as he smiled, his face became more and more ferocious, which scared Ching Ching so much that she couldn't help but take a step back. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at the little foxes who had volunteered to join in the fun and asked one of them to go with Ching Ching. Although they were not powerful in the cultivation world, they were more than enough to deal with these Yamaguchi-kun. The little fox that had been chosen was overjoyed. She immediately put on an arrogant look and followed Nishikura Haruo and the others out in a line. The black-clothed members of Yamaguchi-gumi finally left, and the shop of Desanxian suddenly became brighter, but the upstairs and downstairs were a mess. Li Yundong gestured to the other little foxes in a low voice, motioning for them to clean up. At this time, Chris, who had been silent all this time, came up and whispered, Master, are you really going to open the shop in Japan? Li Yundong looked at her strangely and said, Didn't I already refuse these Japanese? Chris hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice, if you invest in Japan, maybe I can help. If you want to open a tea shop in the United States, I have a way. Li Yundong looked at Chris in surprise. Before he could speak, his eyes involuntarily swept over Han Zhen and Jim, who were not far away. Han Zhen had naturally heard what Chris had said, especially what had happened just now, which made him feel as if he had been slapped in the face twice. Although Li Yundong hadn't said a word of humiliation to him, he felt his face burning. He wanted to find a hole to hide in immediately. Jim, on the other hand, didn't have such thoughts. His idea was very simple. He was a hedonistic son of rich parents, so he naturally looked down on those commoners. However, if the other party also displayed powerful strength and background, then he naturally wouldn't be so stupid as to bare his teeth at the other party. No matter how retarded hedonistic sons of rich parents were, their family background and starting point were still much higher than that of ordinary people. As long as they used their brains a little, they would be able to think and see much more than ordinary people. At this time, in Jim's opinion, this dark-headed and yellow-skinned countryman didn't look as eye-catching as before, but he still felt a little uncomfortable. In particular, Chris's tough attitude made him feel even more embarrassed. Han Zhen kicked Jim gently, motioning for him to speak. Jim said to Chris, "Chris, are you really not going back?" Chris hesitated for a moment, glanced at Li Yundong, and then shook her head decisively. "No, I'm already an adult. Jim, you go back. Say hello to Mom and Dad and Grandma for me." Jim muttered a few words. He wanted to bulge his eyes and yell at Li Yundong, "King, look after my sister. If anything happens to her, I'll break your bones. Or my eyes are on you. Don't act recklessly." But the previous scene had really frightened him, a playboy. He couldn't say such words that had been easy to say in the past. He hesitated, but Han Zhen, who was beside him, simply pulled him away with a dark expression. The two of them walked far away before they slowed down their pace. Jim looked dejected and muttered, "We came here for nothing." Han Zhen glanced at him contemptuously, but when he looked up at him, he smiled again. He pushed the gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose, smiled slightly and said, "It doesn't matter. Let's go back first. After we go back, I have a way to get Chris back." Jim turned his head to look at him. "Do you really have a way?" Han Zhen turned his head to look in the direction of Desangxian, and a trace of haze flashed across the corner of his eyes. He smiled coldly and said, "Let's wait and see." Chapter 738. After Nishikyu Haruo and the others left, Li Yundong waited in the Desangxian tea shop for a while. While discussing the future management of the tea shop with Feng Na, he waited for Ching Cheng and the accompanying little fox. When Ching Cheng and the others came back, Li Yundong saw her smiling face with her eyes narrowed into a line, so he felt relieved. He turned to Feng Na and said with a smile, "I'll leave this place to you in the future. I'll come here often." After saying goodbye to Feng Na, Ching Cheng, and the little foxes on duty in the shop, Li Yundong walked out of the Desangxian with Ziyuan and Chris. Walking on the street, Li Yundong looked at Chris, who had her head lowered, and suddenly asked softly, "Chris, do you really not want to go back?" Chris looked up at Li Yundong with resentment in her eyes, but this emotion only lasted for a moment. Soon, she calmed down and said to Li Yundong, "Master, are you really not going to consider driving the Desangxian to the United States?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "Let's put this matter aside for now. I appreciate your kindness. By the way, how long will it take for the crew to finish shooting?" Chris thought for a moment and said softly, "It should be more than 10 days. Li Yundong asked curiously, "So soon?" Chris couldn't help but look at Li Yundong with a complaining look. She was very unhappy that Li Yundong had left her alone in the crew. She said in a low voice, "Although I'm the second female lead, I don't have many scenes. The people in the crew take good care of me, so the shooting progress is very fast." Li Yundong knew what Chris was feeling. He smiled slightly and said, "That's good. In a while it will be the Spring Festival. At that time the crew should be on holiday. You should come back quickly at that time. We'll have a New Year's Eve dinner together." Chris suddenly raised her head and looked at Li Yundong with a twinkle in her eyes. As a China expert among Americans, she naturally knew what the Spring Festival and the New Year's Eve dinner meant to the Chinese people. If they hadn't regarded her as a close person, they probably wouldn't have invited her. However, Li Yundong didn't seem to notice her strange gaze and said, "You are alone outside and you don't want to go back. You will definitely be very lonely during the New Year. Anyway, you are my nominal disciple now. It will be good for you to come over and have some fun with us." Chris felt slightly relieved and whispered in her heart with some disappointment, "So that's how it is?" Chris nodded silently and followed behind him. This foreign girl, who was now in a state of confusion, had no idea what kind of amazing achievements she would have in the future. At this time she felt like she was sandwiched between two pieces of bread. If it weren't for her stubborn character and the faith that John and her grandmother had given her, she would have given up on this cultivation trip in China. Li Yundong glanced at Chris and said, "By the way, how much did you deal with Chow Kefi and the crew?" Chris restrained her thoughts. She thought about it carefully and said, "Not much, but President Chow is very kind to me." Li Yundong nodded and asked, "Does she usually do anything strange?" Chris looked at Li Yundong in confusion and asked, "Strange behavior?" Ziyuan, who had been silent all this time, suddenly glanced at Li Yundong with flickering eyes, but she quickly withdrew her gaze and quietly listened to the conversation between the two of them. Li Yundong didn't notice Ziyuan's gaze. He still looked at Chris seriously and said, "Well, for example, some abnormal behavior in her personality? Or don't you feel that she sometimes doesn't act like herself?" Chris's gaze became more and more strange. She thought for a moment and said, "No, but President Chow has rarely shown up in recent days. She often stays in her room alone and doesn't come out. Sometimes even Lu Fair can't see her." Li Yundong frowned slightly and nodded secretly. He laughed and said, "Then are you going to rest in Tiannan City for 2 days or are you going back?" Chris ran her fingers through her long blonde hair and pursed her lips. Although her eyes were full of fatigue, her face showed her determination and stubbornness. She said softly, "I'd better go back first. The crew is waiting for me to film." Li Yundong turned to look at Ziyuan and said, "Ziyuan, will you see her off?" Without waiting for Ziyuan to speak, Chris shook her head and said, "No, I'll go back by myself." Li Yundong asked curiously, "Did you bring your passport? Do you have money on you?" Chris nodded and said, "I brought everything. Don't worry about me." Li Yundong asked in confusion, "Isn't it much faster to ask Ziyuan to send you back?" Chris looked at Ziyuan, then shook her head firmly and refused. "No, I'll take the next flight back by myself. You don't need to send me back." As she said this, she quickly ran out and stopped a taxi on the street. She waved to Li Yundong and Ziyuan and then quickly left. Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan and shook his head. This girl has a strong self-esteem. Does she not like the feeling of flying at high altitude? Ziyuan smiled slightly and said, "She doesn't like the feeling of being pulled in the air by others. She wants to fly with her own strength." Li Yundong sighed softly. What a stubborn girl. Ziyuan looked at Li Yundong and asked, "If you still don't want to accept her as your disciple, then let her go back quickly. Don't delay others." Li Yundong shook his head. "It's not that I don't want to accept her as my disciple, but I haven't observed her well enough. Although I have seen some sects accept many foreigners as disciples these days, I always feel that something is wrong. Although I have never come into contact with these foreigners, I don't know why they cultivate. But I always feel that they are only chasing after a mysterious power, not out of yearning for the profound culture of our Chinese nation." Ziyuan smiled slightly. "So you still want to observe her for a while? Why do I feel that you want to do an experiment on her?" Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan in surprise. This idea was in his subconscious and he didn't even notice it. But when Ziyuan pointed it out, his heart suddenly became clear. Li Yundong couldn't help but praise, "My parents gave birth to me and Ziyuan knows me well." "You're right. I've been thinking that if I accept her as my disciple, with her talent and intelligence, and the fact that she has absorbed the divine aura of Elixir, she will definitely have great achievements in the future. If she falls in love with the Tao, that's fine. But if one day, I'm gone and she betrays her sect, what should I do? Or perhaps, the Tao technique that she learned was accidentally spread out one day and learned by bad people. What should we do then?" Ziyuan accompanied Li Yundong as they walked slowly side by side on the bustling street. One of them had an elegant temperament and a beautiful appearance, while the other was elegant, tall and slender. They were really a golden boy and a jade girl, attracting countless people to keep looking back. But the two of them acted as if there was no one else around, whispering and concentrating. After listening to Li Yundong's words, Ziyuan said in a low voice, "You think too much. As long as you accept a disciple, there must be risks. According to what you said, Jinren Zhang Jishuan should not be able to sleep every day." Li Yundong sighed helplessly. When the Shantian sect came to Mount Longhu, there were so many foreigners inside, especially the 3 formation eyes of the Shantian formation. 2 of them were actually foreigners, which really made me feel a lot. Inkong said so many things on the mountain, but I agree with one thing. Courtesy is lost in the wild. Up until now, the traditional culture of China is being lost and lost every day. Although the cultivation world is slowly recovering now, you can see that the leaders of Jingyi school, Chuanjin sect, and other sects are all focused on cultivation and are unwilling to get involved in worldly affairs. The other people in charge are focused on fighting for power and profit. Only a few people want to promote the cultivation method. The most important thing is that the government does not support these things, so the people can't understand them. In particular, the lack of traditional culture has led to the lack of cultivation soil, so the way of cultivation naturally can't be developed. It's useless to just rely on us here to advocate and wave the flag. Ziyuan glanced at Li Yundong and said softly, "Haven't you ever thought about going abroad?" Li Yundong shook his head. Although foreign countries are more free and relaxed, the cultivation soil is thinner. Moreover, my roots are here and I won't leave. Ziyuan smiled. "So you want to experiment on Chris?" Li Yundong nodded gently. "I want to see if she can perfectly realize my idealized goal." Ziyuan asked tentatively, "Let her cultivate out of love for our China's traditional culture, rather than out of yearning for mysterious power?" Li Yundong smiled bitterly. "Does this sound a little difficult? It seems that I began to be interested in cultivation because of this mysterious power. But after all, she is different. She is a Westerner." Ziyuan sighed softly and said, Yes, after all, people who are not of our race must have different hearts. Your worry is also reasonable. If it were just ordinary foreigners, it would be fine. They may not necessarily have high achievements, but Chris is different. If she suddenly betrays us in the future, the consequences will be too serious and terrible. Li Yundong nodded and said, well, only when Chris has a strong sense of identity and even a sense of belonging to our China culture will she never have a rebellious heart. Ziyuan laughed. After saying so much, it's actually just one sentence. You want to assimilate her. Li Yundong also laughed. When Western culture invades on a large scale, why can't we assimilate a Westerner? Look at the history of China. During the chaos of the 5 barbarians, our Han people were killed and became a minority, but in the end they were all assimilated by us. During the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, ethnic minorities invaded and were also assimilated by us. During the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols occupied the Central Plains, and during the Qing dynasty the Manchus entered the country, but in the end they couldn't escape the fate of being assimilated by us. As he said this, Li Yundong turned his head and looked at Ziyuan with flickering eyes. Why can't we assimilate these Westerners? Instead we want them to assimilate us in turn? Ziyuan nodded and said seriously, I know what you mean, but Li Yundong, since you have such great ambitions, you have to understand that if you want to do these things, you and your current Fox Zen school will never be able to do it. You have to start your own sect. Li Yundong pondered for a while. Start a sect? Ziyuan said, that's right. If you do these things as the leader of the Fox Zen school, no one will approve of what you have done. No matter how much you do in the future, when people talk about you in the future, they will just say, meddling in other people's business, and comment on you. Only after you establish your own sect and use Desanxian as a medium can you spread your ideas and beliefs to every corner of the world. In this way, everything you do will be recognized, and you will be remembered by history and future generations. Li Yundong was silent for a long time before he raised his head and sighed. The views of the secular world are really deep-rooted. I see. Let's talk about this later. Let's go back first. The two of them talked along the way and walked home for a long time. As soon as they entered the house, they saw that the living room was full of people, all of them looking anxious and nervous. Li Yundong was stunned. What happened? When Su Chan, who was in the living room, saw Li Yundong, she immediately rushed over like a gust of wind and hugged him. Her eyes were full of tears. She cried, Yundong master is missing? Li Yundong was shocked. What? Ao Wushuang is missing? Where did she go? Chapter 739. At this time, Su Chan was already in a panic. She sobbed and said, I don't know. I was just too tired to stay by her side. I slept for a while and when I woke up, master was gone. Li Yundong's face darkened and he frowned, but he comforted her by saying, don't cry. It's not your fault. If your master wants to leave, I can't stop him. But, where could she have gone? Then Li Yundong was shocked and looked at Su Chan in horror. Your master didn't go to find Wang Yuanshan, did he? Su Chan raised her head with tears in her eyes. Sherboy and I thought the same, but we didn't dare to go, so we've been waiting for you to come back. Li Yundong took a deep breath. He knew that if Ao Wushuang went to find Wang Yuanshan, she would definitely make a scene in Mount Longhu, and her ending would definitely not be good. Li Yundong's expression changed and he said in a low voice, don't worry, I'll go to Mount Longhu now. Ziyuan hurriedly said, no, you can't go. Li Yundong gave her a strange look and asked, why? Li Yundong, Ao Wushuang may not necessarily go to Mount Longhu, and all of us can go, but you can't appear for this matter. Ziyuan was a little embarrassed. Li Yundong was stunned and didn't understand, but he soon realized something after thinking about it. If Ao Wushuang really goes to Mount Longhu to make trouble, I, the leader, will be in big trouble. Should I stand up for her or not? If he stood up for her, wouldn't he be going against Wang Yuanshan? If he fought with him, what would happen to Ziyuan? If he didn't stand up for her, how was he going to explain himself to Su Chan? Li Yundong sighed helplessly. He originally wanted to let Ziyuan go, but he was afraid that she would be in a difficult position. After thinking for a while, Li Yundong looked up at Zhou Qin, who was looking at him worriedly not far away, and said, Zhou Qin, can you go? Be polite. If Ao Wushuang is not here, you can come back. If she is here, you can try to mediate. How about that? The Jingyi school also owes me a favor. If you go, it will be easier for both sides to step down. Zhou Qin nodded without hesitation. Okay, I'll go. With that, she didn't delay any longer and flashed out of the door. After watching her leave, Li Yundong said softly to Su Chan, don't worry. Your master is an experienced and prudent person. Unlike you, she won't do anything stupid. However, even Li Yundong himself didn't believe what he had just said. In his opinion, with Ao Wushuang's temperament, she definitely couldn't accept the fact that Wang Yuanshan had betrayed her. If she didn't do something extreme, it would be strange for her to be aggressive. It was just that Li Yundong hadn't expected it to happen so soon. In his arms, Su Chan raised her head. Although she knew that he was comforting her, she did feel much better. She nodded gently and said in a choked voice, I know. I won't do anything stupid. Li Yundong smiled and said, all right, don't stand here. You're crying like a kitten. Go wash your face and wait for Zhou Qin's news later. Su Chan nodded and walked to the bathroom while wiping her tears. Zi Yuan, who was beside him, pulled Li Yundong's arm and glanced at his room. She said in a low voice, Li Yundong, I want to have a word with you. Li Yundong nodded and followed her into the room. He asked, what's the matter? Zi Yuan said in a low voice, I saw you ask Chris about Chao Kefi before. Do you have any ideas? Li Yundong sighed softly and said, yes. I want to help Chao Kefi keep her divine sense and memory. Zi Yuan was shocked. You want to snatch her body from the mystical silver fox? Li Yundong frowned slightly. I know that the mystical silver fox is very difficult to deal with, but her strength must not have recovered yet, so Chao Kefi's memory and divine sense are still alive. But I'm afraid that with the passage of time, the power of the mystical silver fox will become stronger and stronger, and Chao Kefi's memory and divine sense will slowly become chaotic, thin, and finally disappear completely. At that time, Chao Kefi will no longer be Chao Kefi, but the real mystical silver fox. Zi Yuan couldn't help smiling bitterly. But do you know how difficult it is to keep Chao Kefi's divine sense and memory? Li Yundong sighed and said, of course I know. This is the mystical silver fox, a devil who has turned China and Japan upside down. It can even be said that before the Tang dynasty, the nine-tailed fox was a divine beast worshipped by the world, but after her, the nine-tailed fox became synonymous with disaster and disaster. However, do I give up saving my friend just because the opponent is very strong and abnormal? Zi Yuan fell silent. After a while, she said softly, I only know two ways. Li Yundong was overjoyed. I knew you had a way. Tell me quickly. Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, the first way is to completely destroy the soul of the mystical silver fox and kill her in Chao Kefi's body. Li Yundong immediately smiled bitterly. You'd better tell me the next way. This way is definitely not going to work. This is something that neither the Chinese cultivation world nor the Japanese cultivation world has been able to do. The cultivation of the mystical silver fox has reached the peak of the golden immortal realm. Her soul can't be erased, it can only be sealed. If we want to kill her soul by force, we can only ask the ninth heaven divine night thunder to strike down and then attack with the magic formation. Will the mystical silver fox stupidly drill into the magic formation? Even if she is willing, a bolt of divine thunder will strike down. Before the magic formation can work, Chao Kefi will have already turned into nothingness. Zi Yuan also said helplessly, I also know that this method won't work, but it's also a way. The second way is... Zi Yuan gently bit her lip, looking like she wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Li Yundong rarely saw her like this. He couldn't help asking curiously, what's wrong? Is there anything you can't say? Zi Yuan hesitated for a moment and said softly, the second way is to use a special magic weapon to seal her first, and then use another kind of magic weapon to separate the divine sense and memories of Chao Kefi and the mystical silver fox. Li Yundong was overjoyed. Is there such a magic weapon? What kind of magic weapon is it? Zi Yuan sighed softly, shook her head and didn't speak for a while. Li Yundong couldn't help saying, what kind of magic weapons are they? Is it inconvenient to say? At this time a person suddenly rushed in from the door. It was Ruan Hongling, who had been staring at Li Yundong and Zi Yuan since they entered the door. The girl had been eavesdropping at the door for a long time. At this time she finally couldn't help rushing in and shouting, it's the azure glass mirror and the purple gold luo jade plate. Li Yundong didn't react for a moment. Ah, these two magic weapons? Where are they? The names of these two magic weapons sound so familiar. Aren't they the two magic weapons you once gave me to pass through the heavenly tribulation? Zi Yuan glared at Ruan Hongling fiercely, nodded silently and didn't say anything. Li Yundong looked at Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan with a smile and said, I haven't seen you use them since the last time you went through the heavenly tribulation. Now they come in handy again. There's no time to lose. These two magic weapons should be with you, right? Shall we go now? Ruan Hongling said anxiously, Shiji, do you still want to hide it from me now? Li Yundong finally noticed that something was wrong. He looked at Ruan Hongling doubtfully and then at Ziyuan. You too. Ziyuan sighed faintly and took out the purple gold luo jade plate and the azure glass mirror from her sleeve. Li Yundong looked at them and was shocked. Why are they all broken? Why are they cracked like this? Li Yundong looked up at Ziyuan and his heart suddenly skipped a beat. He cried out involuntarily, could it be that they were damaged when you helped me pass through the heavenly tribulation? Ruan Hongling said loudly, did you just find out? Do you know how much my Shiji has sacrificed for you? These are the powerful magical weapons of our Lingong sect. It was because they were destroyed in Shiji's hands that she was almost punished by the sect rules during the succession ceremony. Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan in shock. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Ziyuan glared at Ruan Hongling angrily, but when she looked at Li Yundong she pretended to be calm and said calmly, it's nothing. It's just a small matter. Li Yundong couldn't help but say angrily, is this a small matter? What kind of person do you think I am? As he said this, he strode forward and snatched the two powerful magical weapons from Ziyuan's hands. He said angrily, I've told you everything. Why are you still hiding something from me? When Ziyuan saw him scolding her, although there was a helpless smile on her face, she felt warm in her heart. She said softly, I just don't want to cause you any trouble. Li Yundong glared at her and said, you're the one who's causing me trouble. As he said this, he turned his head to look at Ruan Hongling. Do you know if these two things can be repaired? Ruan Hongling turned a blind eye to Ziyuan's threatening gaze and quickly said, of course I know. Li Yundong asked, tell me quickly. Ziyuan is unreliable. I don't believe her. Tell me I believe you. Ruan Hongling was very proud of herself. She made a face at Ziyuan and then proudly shook her head and said, you want to know? Li Yundong said seriously, of course. Ruan Hongling pointed at Ziyuan and said, ask my Shiji. Li Yundong pretended to be angry and said, I already said that I don't believe her. But before he could finish speaking, Ruan Hongling made a face at him again and said, but only Shiji knows. Li Yundong said angrily, hey, are you kidding me? You just said that you knew. Ruan Hongling chuckled and said, I know that Shiji knows. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard this, and Ziyuan couldn't help but burst into laughter. Li Yundong turned his head helplessly and said to Ziyuan in a drawling voice, Ziyuan. Leniency for those who confess, severity for those who resist. You know our party's policy. Ziyuan shook her head helplessly and said with a faint smile, I'm really afraid of you. You have to get involved in this matter. Li Yundong said unhappily, what do you mean? Could it be that after you've done so much for me, you're not happy that I'm doing something for you? What kind of person do you think I am? Even passers-by don't treat me like an outsider, do they? What kind of person do I think you are? Ziyuan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment her heart raced. Her eyes flashed and she lowered her head. After a long time, she looked up and said with a chuckle, I only know that there is a sect in the cultivation world that is good at repairing powerful magical weapons. But that was a rumor more than 200 years ago and I heard it from my master. I don't know if it's true now. Li Yundong quickly asked, which sect? Chapter 740. Ziyuan looked at him and said with a slight smile, it's the Penglai sect. Li Yundong asked curiously, Penglai sect? Isn't he from a small sect? Ziyuan nodded slightly. It is indeed a small sect, but it was also a famous sect during the Tang and Song dynasties. However, during the Yuan, Ming and Qing dynasties with the rise of Jingyi school and Xuanzhen school, it slowly declined. Li Yunyang thought for a moment and said, I remember that when the 6 great sects besieged Mount Tianlong, we met the Penglai sect. Later we also met them on Mount Gazao. Ziyuan said, yes, during the inauguration ceremony, there were also people from the Penglai sect on the stage. I remember that this person from the Penglai sect seems to be called Yu Manlu. My master once told me that the secret of the Penglai sect is repairing powerful magical weapons, but I don't know if the current leader, Yu Qing, has passed down this secret skill. Li Yundong hesitated for a moment before saying decisively, then let's not delay any longer. Shall we go now? Ziyuan advised softly, aren't you waiting for Zhou Qin? Let's wait for her to come back. Even if the Penglai sect can repair the transcendent artifact, it won't be possible in a short time. Ruan Hongling suddenly said, Shiji Ziyuan, I want to go too. Take me with you. Ziyuan glared at her. What are you going to do? Cultivate well at home. Ruan Hongling immediately became unhappy. Are you afraid that I'll be the third wheel? These words made Ziyuan blush, and she glared at Ruan Hongling as if she wanted to eat someone. However, Ruan Hongling seemed to be used to this kind of gaze. She made a face at Ziyuan, then waved her fist at Li Yundong and said, "Hey, take care of my Shiji or else, humph." Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he watched her turn around and walk out of the door. The ponytail behind her head swayed, full of youthful aura. After Ruan Hongling left, there was a moment of awkwardness in the room. Ziyuan lowered her head and said in a low voice, I'll go out and see if Ruan Hongling is back." As she spoke, she moved lightly out of the room. Li Yundong knew that Ziyuan had just left, so how could she come back so soon? Ziyuan was deceiving herself and hiding from him. But what else could he do if he didn't hide? Li Yundong sighed softly and sat down in the room. After waiting for more than 2 hours, Zhou Qin came back. The woman, who had traveled more than 3,000 miles back and forth, looked a little travel-worn, but she didn't even have time to take a sip of water before she hurriedly said to Li Yunyang, who was coming out to welcome her, "Master, I didn't see anything in Mount Longhu. It seems that Ao Wushuang didn't go." Su Chan was shocked and anxious. "Master didn't go? Where did Master go?" Li Yundong waved at the little girl. When she leaned against him, he held her in his arms and comforted her softly, "Don't worry. Since your master didn't go to Mount Longhu first, it means that she hasn't gone to the extreme path. Things won't be too bad. Maybe she just wants to be alone and doesn't want us to disturb her." Su Chan also agreed with him. She calmed down a little and looked at him eagerly. "But when can I see Master again?" Li Yundong patted the little girl's head and said softly, "Cultivate well. When you become very, very strong, then you can go to Mount Longhu and force Wang Yuanshan to explain clearly why he abandoned your master." Okay. In Li Yundong's opinion, the best way to comfort the little girl was to set an unreachable goal for her. Then this goal would drive her to temporarily forget her worries and sadness and then turn all her attention to cultivation. At first, he had endured the separation from the little girl and the pain of lovesickness. He had focused all his attention on cultivation, which had made him progress by leaps and bounds. After hearing Li Yundong's words, Su Chan's eyes lit up. She nodded hard, her beautiful lips pressed tightly, and there was a firm and decisive look on her face. Li Yundong smiled in his heart. Although Ao Wushuang was missing, it was a blessing in disguise. Who knew if this would become an opportunity for Su Chan to explode? Li Yundong gently stroked the little girl's soft black hair and turned to Zhou Qin. "Zhou Qin, I'm going to Penglai with Ziyuan. Please take care of the family." Zhou Qin asked curiously, "Master, what are you going to Penglai for?" Li Yundong looked at Chao Yi, Lu Yuehong and the others who were also looking at him and explained, "I'm going to the Penglai sect to see if I can repair Ziyuan's Tongtian glass mirror and Zijin Luoyu plate." "The Penglai sect?" Before Zhou Qin could speak, Chao Yi suddenly said in surprise, "Leader, why do you suddenly want to repair these two powerful magical weapons?" Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan and said, "Don't you know that Ziyuan was almost arrested and put in prison by the Jingyi school because she damaged these two powerful magical weapons? If the Japanese hadn't come, I'm afraid I would have had to fight with the Jingyi school. Moreover, in order to help me get through the heavenly tribulation, Ziyuan destroyed these two powerful magical weapons. I have to help her repair them, right? Besides Chao." Before Li Yundong could finish his words, Ziyuan suddenly said, "Li Yundong, let's take Su Chan to Penglai later." Li Yundong was stunned. Before he could speak, Su Chan grabbed his sleeve and said firmly in a low voice, "Yundong, I want to go with you." Li Yundong glanced at Ziyuan and thought to himself, "Is it because you want to avoid arousing suspicion that you took Su Chan with you? Ziyuan, you're really tired of living." Since Ziyuan had made such a gesture and Su Chan had made a firm request, Li Yundong didn't say anything more. He gently patted Su Chan on the shoulder, smiled at her, and motioned for her to go to Penglai with him. Then Li Yundong nodded to Zhou Qin and then to Chao Yi. Finally, he said a few words to the little foxes at home and took Ziyuan and Su Chan out. After Li Yundong went out of the door, Lu Yuehong looked at the backs of Li Yundong and the others and couldn't help sighing faintly. "Leader is really... Why is he so busy? It seems that he doesn't go home all day long." Chao Yi glanced at Li Yundong's room, covered her mouth and chuckled. "Leader has always been here." Lu Yuehong came to her senses and said with a smile, "He's here but his soul isn't." After chatting and laughing for a while, they returned to their respective rooms. But what no one knew was that after Chao Yi returned to her room, she quickly wrote a small note and put it in the body of a small paper crane. Then she walked to the balcony and looked around. With a spread of her palm, the small paper crane flapped its wings and flew up with a whoosh. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared into the horizon. The paper crane flew all the way in the direction of Dongwu City. No one would have noticed such a small paper crane flying in the air. It passed through the bustling streets and came to the bustling Shantang town of Dongwu City. Then, it flew over the heads of the crowd and finally came to a secluded pavilion. It folded its wings and quietly landed beside a mahogany windowsill with an open window. As soon as the paper crane landed, a strong and powerful hand stretched out. It was Lu Yi. Lu Yi picked up the paper crane and took off the note in it. After glancing at it for a moment, he clenched the paper ball tightly and frowned. He stood by the windowsill like a stone statue, motionless. A middle-aged man's voice came from behind him. He chuckled and said, "What's wrong? Is there any bad news?" The person who spoke was Wang Jinyuan, who had disappeared for a long time. At this time, the master of the Gizao sect, who had cut his wrist in the Battle of Tiandu Peak, had achieved a transformation in his cultivation. He had smoothly entered the Jinshin phase from the Yangshin phase and had even cultivated to the intermediate level of the Jinshin. At this time, the aura all over his body had changed from being released to being restrained. He looked no different from an ordinary middle-aged man, but his face had a strong foreign aura and a pair of bright eyes, which made him particularly eye-catching. Lu Yi didn't turn his head and asked in a deep voice, "Do you know Yu Qing of the Penglai sect?" Wang Jinyuan said curiously, "I do. What's wrong?" Lu Yi turned around and asked with flickering eyes, "Does she know how to repair powerful magical weapons?" Wang Jinyuan laughed and said, "I think so. But how do you know?" "Only a few cultivators know this news. I went to Penglai with my master a long time ago and saw him looking for Yu Qing's master to repair powerful magical weapons. At that time Yu Qing was still a little girl, so she accompanied him. Now more than 30 years have passed. I think she should have inherited this unique skill, right?" Lu Yi narrowed his eyes slightly. He put his hands behind his back and paced back and forth in the room. After a while, he suddenly raised his head and said in a deep voice, "I'm going to Penglai. Can you introduce Yu Qing to me?" Wang Jinyuan stroked his beard proudly and said, "Of course I can help you. But why do you want to see Yu Qing? Do you have any powerful magical weapons to repair?" Lu Yi stopped and said, "Me? No, I'm not going to find her to repair powerful magical weapons." Wang Jinyuan asked curiously, "Then what are you going to do?" The corners of Lu Ye's mouth curled up slightly, and a cold smile appeared on his face. "I'm going to kill her." Wang Jinyuan took a deep breath. "What? You have no grudge against her. Why do you want to kill her?" Lu Yi turned his head and stared at Wang Jinyuan coldly. "Others may not know, but I know it best. If Yu Qing repairs the glass mirror of heaven and the purple gold Luoyu plate, the mystical silver fox will be in trouble. I can't sit back and watch someone threaten the growth of the mystical silver fox. Before the second day of February comes, I will help her clear away any obstacles and troubles in front of her. Are you going?" Wang Jinyuan frowned slightly. "But you don't have to be so cruel." There was a hint of cruelty and ferocity in Lu Ye's eyes. He snorted coldly and said, "How do I know if she is willing to cooperate with me? In my opinion, the dead are the most reliable." Wang Jinyuan sighed and shook his head. "I always thought that I was ruthless enough. It turns out that compared with you, I am simply a kind man. I have a good personal relationship with Yu Qing. I can't do this. At most, I won't help you inform her. You can go by yourself." There was a flash of contempt in Lu Ye's eyes, but he quickly restrained his gaze and said in a deep voice, "Well, help me do another thing." As he spoke, he said a few words to Wang Jinyuan in a low voice. After that, he stared at Wang Jinyuan and said, "Do you understand? Well, I'll go first." Wang Jinyuan watched Lu Yi walk out of the room unhurriedly. He looked at the back of the old fox with a complicated look in his eyes and shook his head. He sighed in his heart, "Old thing, have you finally found that Li Jiandong has gotten out of your control? Are you flustered? Are you nervous? Hey, don't worry. You should be busy with the plan first. I will give you an unexpected surprise." Wang Jinyuan thought silently in his heart. The corners of his mouth curled into a slight smile, and his eyes were full of complacency. I'm very uncomfortable. There's still one more night to go. I won't come out today. I'll make up for it tomorrow. Chapter 741. After Li Yundong, Su Chan, and Zi Yuan left the door, they flew all the way in the direction of Yantai, Shandong. After flying for about 2 hours, they slowly landed. It was already 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The three of them chose a remote place to land, took a taxi, and drove in the direction of Penglai Pavilion. Perhaps the driver had seen the amazing beauty of Su Chan and Zi Yuan, so he kept introducing the customs of Penglai along the way. Especially when he heard that they were going to Penglai Pavilion, he said enthusiastically, "Oh, it's too late to go to Penglai Pavilion now. Why don't we go earlier? We can play a few more places. If we go now we have to go back after a while. It's late winter now and the weather is getting late. Why bother?" Li Yundong and the others just smiled and did not answer. Seeing that they did not speak, the driver was not discouraged. He drove them through a street with a lot of seafood, still enthusiastically introducing Li Yundong and the others to eat seafood. Although Su Chan and Zi Yuan had long heard of the reputation of Penglai, this was the first time they had come here. Both of them were curiously looking at the city of Penglai. However, Zi Yuan was still sitting upright, but her head was slightly tilted. Her eyes were looking out of the car window, looking at everything around her. Su Chan, on the other hand, twisted her body and leaned against the window. She rolled down the window and rested her elbows on the glass, letting the wind blow her hair into a messy mess. Perhaps because she had heard the driver talk too much, Su Chan suddenly turned her face and said to the driver, "Look at you, it should be a sign of spleen and stomach deficiency. Seafood is very cold. I advise you to eat less seafood. Do you sometimes have diarrhea when you go back after eating seafood?" The driver was stunned for a moment. He opened his mouth wide and said, "How do you know that I like seafood? How do you know that I have diarrhea many times after eating seafood?" Su Chan raised a finger and said earnestly, "Look at you, I know that you like seafood. Eating seafood will make your spleen and stomach cold. Once the spleen and stomach are cold, it is easy to have diarrhea. These two places are not good. No matter what kind of cold food you eat, it is easy to have diarrhea. Sometimes when you eat too much, of course you will have diarrhea." The driver patted his thigh. "I thought that the seafood in some places was not clean. So that's how it is." While the two of them were talking, they had arrived at Penglai Pavilion unknowingly. After they got out of the car, they saw that at this time, the sky was already full of sunset clouds. Penglai Pavilion seemed to be covered with a layer of deep oil paint in the twilight of the sea and the sky, and its whole body was a strong color of vicissitudes. The driver also got out of the car. He wanted to talk to Su Chan again, but he saw the three of them walk to a corner. When he followed them, the three of them had disappeared. The driver stared at the straight street, dumbfounded. After a while, he slapped his thigh and said, "I've met a god. I was wondering why these three people had such an immortal aura. It turns out that they are immortals. As the saying goes, there is a fairyland in the human world, and Penglai is the place to attain the Tao." Penglai could be said to be the earliest land of fairy mountains in China. As early as the Qin and Han dynasties, it had been famous all over the world. At this time, Mount Longhu was just a nameless mountain, and Mount Mao and Mount Gazao were even more unvisited barren mountains. There was a very deep Taoist tradition on this land. Many people still retained their Taoist beliefs and yearning for the stories of immortals. After Li Yundong and the others got rid of the enthusiastic driver, they walked all the way in the direction of Penglai Pavilion. The three of them looked from a distance and saw the ancient city tower standing by the sea. The towering city wall was like a crouching giant, a long winding dragon. Under the city wall were surging waves. Looking at the sea, the golden crows gradually fell, the colorful clouds were dense, and the sky was surrounded by clouds and mist. It was like an overseas fairyland. Nearby, there was an ancient city wall covered in multicolored light. The arrow mounds on the city wall were arranged in order, extending into the distance, revealing a strong sense of historical vicissitudes. Penglai Pavilion was located at the highest point at the end of the city wall, as if they were ascending to the sky, looking at the sky and looking straight at the fairyland. Li Yundong had seen the dilapidation and vicissitudes of Mount Gazao, the beauty and magnificence of Mount Longhu, and the magnificence of Tiandu Peak. At this time he suddenly saw this fairyland on earth that had been famous for a long time. For a moment he couldn't help but be overwhelmed by this scene. Even though Su Chan had been in a low mood along the way, she couldn't help but feel refreshed at this time. She opened her small mouth wide and said with a surprised face, "It's really a fairyland on earth. If I cultivated in this place, I'm afraid I would have become an immortal long ago, right? Why has the Penglai sect always been unknown?" Li Yundong looked at this wonder with infatuation and didn't speak. Instead, Zi Yuan said, "Everything in the world will prosper and die." The Penglai sect was at its peak during the Tang and Song dynasties, especially after Lu Dongbin and the 8 immortals ascended to immortality here. At that time the Penglai sect reached its peak. At that time, it had thousands of disciples, and incense was constantly burning all day long. It was a pity that later the descendants of the Penglai sect didn't think about making progress and just sat back and ate. Especially in the early days of the Yuan dynasty, The Penglai sect once sent people to resist the Mongolian army. Later, Genghis Khan and Kublai believed in the words of Qiu Chuji, the Jinren of Eternal Spring, and supported the Chuanjin sect to fight against the Penglai sect. In the last years of the Yuan dynasty, the Penglai sect had been suppressed into a small sect, with no more than a dozen disciples. At this time in the cultivation world, the three Taoist mountains, Mount Longhu, Mount Gizao and Mount Mao, have completely risen. The Taoist cultivation world is divided into the north and the south, and the situation of the three mountains has been formed. All the sects have a deep vigilance against the former glory of the Penglai sect, and from time to time they will suppress this sect. The Penglai sect has never produced any outstanding talents in the past hundreds of years, so it is difficult for them to have a chance to turn around. After Ziyuan finished speaking, Su Chan suddenly sighed and said, "Alas, wasn't our Fox Zen school like this back then? I really want to see with my own eyes what the Fox Zen school was like in its heyday." Li Yundong suddenly glanced at the little girl and thought to himself, Chana is such a simple-minded person, but she still recalls the heyday of the Fox Zen school. No wonder Lu Yi has been trying to resurrect the mystical silver fox. The three of them talked all the way, and before they knew it, they had already arrived at Penglai Pavilion. After buying the tickets and entering, Li Yundong looked at the tickets in his hand and then at the many tourists. He said with a smile, "It seems that at least the Penglai sect will not live a tight life. The ticket income is very impressive." Before Ziyuan and Su Chan could speak, a young man's voice suddenly answered, "Don't mention it. A lot of money has to be turned over to the country. We just take a little money to support our families." Li Yundong and the others turned their heads and saw a handsome man about 1.7 meters tall in a Taoist robe standing in front of them. He was holding a horsetail whisk with one hand and looking at them with a smile. Ziyuan recognized him at a glance. It was Yu Manlu, who she had saved at the inauguration ceremony. Ziyuan smiled slightly, formed a palm with one hand and bowed. "So it's Jinren Yu. Nice to meet you. Are your injuries better?" Yu Manlu quickly glanced at Li Yundong, who was next to Ziyuan, and carefully restrained his admiration. He bowed respectfully and said, "Thank you for your concern, Jinren Ziyuan. I'm much better now. These minor injuries are not a problem." At this time Li Yundong said with a smile, "Jinren Yu, we meet again. How did you know we would come?" Yu Manlu turned around, bowed to Li Yundong respectfully and said with a smile, "The famous fighting celestial master Li Wudi has come to Penglai. There have been many strange phenomena in the sky. When my mother saw such a phenomenon, she concluded that there would be a master coming to our Penglai pavilion today, so she sent me here early to wait." Su Chan asked curiously, "Fighting celestial master? Yundong, when did you get such a nickname?" Yu Manlu said with a smile, "It came from Japan. Jinren Li, you almost defeated the entire Japanese cultivation world with your own strength, so the Japanese call you Fighting Celestial Master. Such a reputation is really enviable." Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, "It's just a nickname. Don't take it seriously. But where is the strange phenomenon you mentioned? Why didn't I see it?" Yu Manlu saw that there was no complacency on Li Yundong's face, as if he didn't take such an honor seriously at all. He couldn't help but admire him even more. He couldn't help but glance at Ziyuan and sigh in his heart. Only such a broad-minded cultivator who is good at fighting can be worthy of Ziyuan Immortal, right? While he was thinking, he saw Su Chan take Li Yundong's hand and point to the distance in the sky. She said cheerfully, "I see it. Look, it's over there." Yu Manlu saw Su Chan and Li Yundong being so intimate, and he couldn't help but notice that Ziyuan was deliberately keeping a distance from Li Yundong. He couldn't help but frown slightly and think to himself, it turns out that these rumors are true. How could Jinren Li be so careless and hang out with this fox demon? His best Taoist companion should be Ziyuan Immortal. Yu Manlu thought about it for a while, only to see that Li Yundong, Su Chan, and Ziyuan were all looking from the direction of Penglai Pavilion to the distance of the sea and the sky. They saw that in the direction of the sea and the sky, clouds and mist covered the sky. In the clouds and mist, there were figures looming. Some were riding donkeys, some were holding long swords, and some were holding treasured fans. It was clearly the scene of the 8 immortals crossing the sea. At this time, Yu Manlu also calmed down and said with a proud smile, "Such a strange phenomenon, isn't it quite magical?" Li Yundong couldn't help but exclaim, "It's really amazing. I'm afraid that such a fairyland can only be seen in Penglai. It is indeed worthy of being called a fairyland on earth. It is really like the sagebrush elixir pavilion leaning against the elixir cliff, overlooking the home of the Yingzhou fairies. Looking at the sun in the Yanggu Valley at night, a clear sky rolling the sea and the clouds. Good, good, good. At this time, the tourists of Penglai Pavilion were gathering on the city tower to take pictures of such a wonderful scene from afar. All kinds of sighs and praises could be heard, but Yu Manlu didn't seem to hear them. Only Li Yundong praised him 3 times in a row. His face immediately became overjoyed and he said proudly, Li Wudi's golden praise, even Penglai, a fairyland on earth, would be honored. Come on in please. Mother has been waiting for you for a long time. Yu Manlu was wearing a Taoist robe, while Li Yundong and the others were dressed like ordinary people. However, they spoke in a genteel manner, and their words and deeds were very similar to those of the ancient people. However, the people around them didn't feel that there was anything strange about them in a place like Penglai Pavilion. On the contrary, many people also learned to salute after seeing the Taoist priests and nuns of Penglai Pavilion. Li Yundong bowed slightly and was about to follow Yu Manlu inside when he suddenly heard a voice beside him. Humph, it's just a mirage. What's so good about it? Strange phenomenon. A group of uneducated bumpkins. == to make up for yesterday's second night watch. I still owe everyone a night watch. I won't forget it. In addition, sometimes the recent page can't be opened. You can click on it more. Recently, the server may be under a little pressure and the company is adjusting it. Chapter 742. Li Yundong and the others looked in the direction of the voice and saw a young man curling his lips with a disapproving look on his face. Next to him was a woman dressed fashionably and wearing a pair of sunglasses. She looked quite beautiful. Yu Manlu frowned slightly and looked at them with an unfriendly gaze. Just as he was about to speak, he saw the young man also turn his head to look at them. However, Li Yundong recognized at a glance that the young man who had spoken was none other than the young man he had met under Potala Palace. Later, the young man had followed the tour guide Wuxia into Potala Palace, and then he didn't know where he had gone. He hadn't expected to meet him here again today. It was really a small world. When the young man saw Li Yundong, he was also stunned for a moment. Then he recognized that the boy in front of him was the man who had been courteously received by the living Buddha under Potala Palace. The woman beside him was also shocked. She tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Isn't this that guy?" The man's face suddenly became a little ugly. He muttered in a low voice, "That's right. How can there be any immortals in this world?" Yu Manlu snorted and said with a sneer, "There are all kinds of things in this world. The people of the immortals are all as simple as bamboo. The way of immortality is the way of nothingness." The young man was dumbfounded and asked, "What did you say?" Li Yundong smiled and said to Yu Manlu, "Jinrenyu, forget it. Let's go. There's no need to talk about these things with such people. People of different paths can't make plans together." Yu Manlu smiled and said, "Jinrenli is right. I was too serious. Come on, follow me to the backyard." They ignored the confused young man and woman and walked toward the depths of Penglai Pavilion. Li Yundong and the others passed by the 3 Pure Palace, LV Hall, Tianho Palace and other places. Pavilions, halls, corridors and walls were clearly layered. Couplets, steels, stone tables, broken tablets, and so on were everywhere, showing the profound cultural heritage of Penglai Pavilion that was different from other places. After crossing the Immortal Bridge, the group arrived in front of the main building of Penglai Pavilion. Li Yundong looked up and saw a pavilion standing at the top of Dan Cliff. This pavilion was about 15 meters high, facing south. It was a double-story wooden structure. The pavilion was surrounded by open corridors for people to climb up and look into the distance. A golden plaque was hanging in the middle of the pavilion. It was the calligraphy of Qing dynasty calligrapher Tai Bao, Penglai Pavilion, these 3 strong and powerful characters. The east and west walls of the pavilion were hung with poems by famous scholars of various dynasties, and they were antique and revealed a deep history. Li Yundong looked back and saw that from this angle, he could see that the fairyland in the distance had slowly faded away, as if the 8 immortals had already drifted across the sea and gradually disappeared. Only the rosy clouds were hanging in the sky, and the sea and the sky were colorful and magnificent. It really made people feel a sense of heroism in their hearts when they looked at it for one more time. Li Yundong couldn't help but sigh and say, "It's really a blessed land of immortals. No wonder Jinrenyu's cultivation is so high at such a young age." Yu Manlu shook his head and said with a smile, "Jinrenli, are you laughing at me? My cultivation is far from yours." Li Yundong naturally knew that he had the good fortune of Renyuan Jindan and Diyuan Jindan, while Yu Manlu had cultivated step by step. If he had cultivated step by step, he might not have been able to reach the Jinshin phase even when he was 30 or 40 years old. However, Yu Manlu looked to be only about 20 years old, but he had already reached the top phase of Yang spirit and was only one step away from the Jinshin phase. Such a cultivation was very rare among the young generation of cultivators in the cultivation world. There was no doubt that this was due to the unique cultivation environment of Penglai. Li Yundong said seriously, "Jinrenyu, don't belittle yourself. Although there is an order to the Tao, there is no time to the Tao. If you get the Tao 10 years earlier, you may not have a higher cultivation than those who get the Tao 10 years later." Yu Manlu suddenly became solemn and bowed to Li Yundong seriously. "Thank you for your guidance, Jinren Li." While they were talking, they had already passed through Penglai Pavilion and arrived at a low courtyard in the backyard. Yu Manlu pushed open a door and said loudly, "Mom, we have guests." A woman's voice came from the room. It was calm and peaceful, making people who heard it feel quiet and peaceful. Li Yundong and the others looked into the room and saw a woman walking out. She was wearing a Taoist robe and looked to be in her 30s. Although she was not beautiful, she had a dignified and noble temperament. The woman glanced around and first looked at Li Yundong. Her eyes lit up and she nodded slightly. Then she looked at Ziyuan and nodded gently. Then her eyes fell on Su Chan, who was next to her. She was stunned for a moment and frowned slightly, but then relaxed again. After the woman finished glancing around, she withdrew her gaze and said to Li Yundong with a smile, "This is Invincible Battler, who is famous all over the world, right? My little Yu has been thinking about you ever since he came back from Mount Longhu. He really admires your amazing cultivation." Li Yundong said with a smile, "Are you the leader of the Penglai sect, Jinren Yuqing?" Yuqing smiled slightly and said, "I don't deserve to be called a Jinren. Our Penglai sect has now been reduced to a small sect. I don't dare to boast in front of Invincible Li at this time." Ziyuan suddenly said, "Jinrenyu, don't be modest. Although the Penglai sect has declined, it may rise one day. Jinrenyu Manlu is young and promising. I think the Penglai sect will grow in his hands." Yu Manlu couldn't help but be overjoyed by Ziyuan's sudden praise. His face was flushed and he almost scratched his ears and cheeks. "Mom, did you hear that? I'm still very good. You keep saying that I'm useless all day long." Yuqing pretended to be angry and glared at him. "Jinren, Ziyuan is being polite to you. You really took it seriously." As she spoke, Yuqing smiled at Ziyuan and said, "Jinren Ziyuan, I haven't thanked you for saving you in Mount Longhu last time. I just don't know what you need my help with this time." Seeing that Yuqing was so open, Ziyuan looked at Li Yundong and motioned for Li Yundong to speak. Li Yundong understood and said to Yuqing, "Jinrenyu, to tell you the truth, we did come here this time to ask for your help." Yuqing chuckled and said, "Jinren Li, you're too polite. If you have something to say, just say it. I'm very grateful for your help in Mount Longhu. If it weren't for the elixirs of the Linggong sect, my Yu wouldn't have recovered so quickly." Ziyuan, who was standing to one side, said with a smile, "Jinrenyu is the one being polite. Even if I didn't help, there would have been cultivators from other sections, I just happened to be there." Yuqing shook her head and said with a chuckle, "That's not necessarily true. Now, although all the sects seem to be courteous to each other on the surface, they are secretly scheming and undermining each other." When Ziyuan heard Yuqing's words, there was a trace of resentment hidden in her tone. She couldn't help but be slightly stunned, but she didn't take it to heart. She just smiled slightly and didn't answer. At this time Li Yundong said, "Jinrenyu, we heard that the Penglai sect is good at repairing powerful magical weapons. I wonder if this unique skill has been passed down?" Yuqing's expression suddenly changed and she looked at Li Yundong with vigilance. "Jinren Li, where did you hear about this?" Seeing Yuqing's hostility rise in an instant, Ziyuan immediately said, "Jinrenyu, my master told me. If it's inconvenient, just pretend that we didn't ask about it." Yuqing glanced at Yu Manlu, who was at the side. Yu Manlu nodded in acknowledgement and walked out. He seemed to be inspecting the surroundings to see if anyone was approaching. Yuqing thought for a while and sighed in a low voice, "I'm really sorry for being rude. Jinren Li, do you know why our Penglai sect has declined to this state?" "It's because our Penglai sect is proficient in this technique." Li Yundong asked curiously, "Why is that?" Yuqing smiled bitterly and said, "Powerful magical weapons are the personal weapons of cultivators. If they are damaged, then this powerful magical weapon will be useless, and the strength of cultivators will also be reduced by more than half. If we want to refine it again, it will take a lot of manpower and material resources. Therefore, the 27th sect leader of the Penglai sect was determined to study the repair of powerful magical weapons. Later, 3 successive sect leaders devoted their energy to it, causing the power of the sect to stagnate. When they developed this technology, the pattern of the cultivation world had completely changed. Jinren, think about it. If the powerful magical weapons of all the cultivation sects in the world are broken, they can only be eliminated and wasted. Only the powerful magical weapons of our Penglai sect are not afraid of being damaged. They can be repaired and reused. Don't you think the other sects are jealous? This is a case of an innocent man getting into trouble because of his wealth. Li Yundong was cautious and didn't answer, but he remained silent. Yu Qing sighed. Yu Qing saw that Li Yundong didn't say anything, but she didn't care. She continued, "Later, all the sects in the cultivation world attacked us together. Some people even took advantage of the situation and threatened us to hand over the secret skills of our Penglai sect. After so many years, our Penglai sect has been passed down from generation to generation. It has long been claimed that this secret skill has been lost, but only a few people know that this secret skill still exists in the world. Wang Yuanshan is one of them. Fortunately, you heard it from him, otherwise." Yu Qing glanced at Yu Manlu outside the door with a bitter smile and said, "Otherwise I would have to flee with my son." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Jinren, you don't have to do this. I still believe that there is justice in the world. The world is big, but the word reason is the most important. Some people can rely on their strength and run amok for a while, but they can never run amok for a lifetime." Yu Qing bowed slightly and praised, "Amit Ba Jinren, well said. What powerful magical weapon do you want to repair this time?" Li Yundong took out the sky-reaching glass mirror and the purple gold jade plate from his arms and presented them to her with both hands. "These are the two powerful magical weapons." Yu Qing glanced at them and was shocked. She cried out involuntarily, "Aren't these the powerful magical weapons of the Linggong sect, the sky-reaching glass mirror and the purple gold jade plate? You want to repair these two powerful magical weapons?" Li Yundong nodded and said, "Yes." Yu Qing's expression changed. She looked at Li Yundong and the others with flickering eyes, gritted her teeth and shook her head resolutely. "No, absolutely not." Li Yundong was shocked. "What?" Chapter 743. Outside the door, although Yu Manlu had been looking around vigilantly, a large part of his attention was also focused on the room, wanting to hear what was being said inside. When he heard Yu Qing's resolute refusal, he couldn't help poking his head in from the door of the room and shouting, "Mom, why not? In any case, they are the people who saved me." Yu Qing glared at him and shouted sternly, "This is none of your business. Get out." Hearing this, Yu Manlu was stunned and immediately retracted his head dejectedly. Yu Qing sighed and said to Li Yundong and Ziyuan with a helpless expression, "Jinren Ziyuan, it's not that I'm ruthless, nor that I don't care about your feelings. It's just that if you want to repair other powerful magical weapons, you can't repair these two." Li Yundong was not a fool, so he quickly responded, "You mean?" Yu Qing nodded and said with a wry smile, "At the inauguration ceremony of the Linggong sect, thousands of cultivators from all sects saw Jinren Ziyuan take out these two damaged powerful magical weapons. But if someone finds out that these two powerful magical weapons have suddenly been repaired, and the only sect in the world that can repair powerful magical weapons is our Penglai sect, and we have been spreading the word that this unique skill has been lost, what do you think they will think? As the saying goes, a wise man will make a mistake." Li Yundong and Ziyuan looked at each other. They had thought a lot before, but this was the only thing they hadn't thought about. Li Yundong smiled bitterly and couldn't find an excuse to persuade her for a while. At this time Ziyuan said, "Jinren, we don't want to repair these powerful magical weapons for the future inauguration ceremony, but for subduing demons. We need to use these two powerful magical weapons." Yu Qing asked curiously, "Subduing demons?" Ziyuan nodded slightly and said, "Yes, we have a friend who is possessed by a demon. We need these two powerful magical weapons to keep her divine sense and memory. Jinren, don't worry. After you repair these two powerful magical weapons, we will definitely not use them in front of everyone so as to cause you trouble." Yu Qing pondered. Although she was a little tempted, this matter was too risky, so she didn't dare to make up her mind for a while. Li Yundong and the others also knew that this matter was very important, and it was very likely to cause a terrible disaster for Yu Qing, so they all remained silent and did not speak. After a long while Yu Qing raised her head and stared at Li Yunyang, saying, "Jinren, do you swear that you will never use this powerful magical weapon in front of outsiders? You won't leak this information?" Li Yunyang said with a solemn face, "Jinren, don't worry. I swear to heaven that if I leak this news, let me die under the thunder." This oath could be said to be the most severe oath for cultivators, and cultivators also believed in karma, so naturally no one would casually make such a vicious oath. Hearing Li Yundong's words, Yu Qing breathed a sigh of relief. She nodded to Li Yundong with a smile and said, "Well, Jinren Li Jinren Ziyuan, wait here for a while. I'll be back soon." As she said this, she bowed to Li Yundong and the others, turned around and walked out of the room, walking into the depths of the backyard. Seeing that Yu Qing had agreed, Li Yundong immediately breathed a sigh of relief. He smiled at Ziyuan, then turned to Su Chan, who had been silent for a long time, and said with a smile, "What are you thinking about? Why haven't I seen you speak?" Su Chan pouted and said, "It's not that I don't want to talk, but that leader Yu doesn't care about me at all." Li Yundong smiled, rubbed the little girl's head and said, "You're too beautiful. I don't want to talk to you, okay?" Su Chan made a face at Li Yundong. "Sister Ziyuan is also very beautiful. Don't comfort me. I know that I'm a fox spirit and not everyone likes me as much as you do. Don't worry, I'm fine. If I were sad because of the discrimination of the world, I would have died of depression long ago." Li Yundong chuckled and said, "That's right. It's good that you can understand." The two of them laughed and talked, but Yu Manlu, who was outside the room, felt upset. He admired Ziyuan very much in his heart, but he also knew that he and Ziyuan were like heaven and earth. He was completely unworthy of her, so he gave up this idea. Instead, he wholeheartedly wanted to matchmake Li Wudi, whom he admired the most, with Ziyuan, the immortal whom he admired the most. At this time, when he saw Li Yundong and Su Chan talking intimately, he began to have the idea of breaking them up. Soon he had an idea. He walked in and said to Su Chan with a smile, "Jinren Su, is this your first time in Penglai?" Su Chan hadn't expected that Yu Manlu would suddenly take the initiative to greet her. She felt strange, but she still said politely, "Yes, Jinren Yu, do you want to be my tour guide?" Su Chan's words were originally polite, but she hadn't expected that Yu Manlu would immediately take advantage of the situation and say, "Well, the evening scenery of our Penglai mountain is the most charming. Why don't you come with me to have a look around?" Su Chan was stunned and thought to herself, "This Yu Manlu is really good at climbing up." I casually greeted him and he climbed up. Su Chan turned to look at Li Yundong helplessly and said, "Yundong, are you going with me?" Li Yundong was thinking about Yu Qing. He knew that if he left Ziyuan here alone, it would be a little inappropriate. However, at this time they were asking for help, and it was a little inappropriate to refuse Yu Manlu's kindness. He could only smile at Su Chan and say, "I won't go. You can go with Jinren Yu and have a look. It's not a wasted trip to the fairyland on Earth." Su Chan had no choice but to reluctantly smile at Yu Manlu and say, "Then I'll have to trouble you, Jinren Yu. I hope you won't find me annoying." Although Yu Manlu disliked Su Chan's fox demon body, Su Chan's stunning beauty was not something he could resist. Although Su Chan's smile was a little forced, Yu Manlu was still stunned. His eyes widened and he was stunned. After a while, he suddenly came to his senses and immediately rushed in front of Su Chan, not daring to look at her again. Li Yundong watched Su Chan and Yu Manlu leave. He smiled slightly and said to Ziyuan, "If things are settled later, let's go and have a look around." Ziyuan smiled slightly and said, "Okay." The two of them waited quietly in the room for Yu Qing, but after waiting for a long time, Yu Qing didn't come back. Li Yundong was slightly surprised and said, "Why hasn't Leader Yu come back yet?" Although Ziyuan also had some doubts in her heart, she still advised, "Maybe Leader Yu has something to prepare. After all, repairing powerful magical weapons is not like other things. It must be quite complicated." The two of them waited for a while. More than an hour had passed. It was already dark outside and the sun had completely set. However, Yu Qing was still nowhere to be seen. At this time, Li Yundong finally felt that something was wrong. He turned to Ziyuan and said, "Something's wrong. There's no reason to be gone for so long." Ziyuan also frowned slightly and said in a low voice, "Yes. What did Leader Yu go to do?" Li Yundong thought for a moment and said seriously, "No, let's go in and have a look." Ziyuan also nodded. Okay. The two of them turned and walked out of the room, following the path that Yu Qing had taken before to the depths of the inner courtyard. In the depths of the inner courtyard of Penglai Pavilion, there was a rather ordinary courtyard. The periphery was surrounded by a wall with white walls and black tiles. The wall was about 2 meters high, and there were round arches and all kinds of exquisite windows on the wall. Further inside was a quadrangle-style corridor. There were many red pillars in the corridor, and the calligraphy was adjacent. In the depths of the corridor, there was an arch hidden in the jungle. Li Yundong and Ziyuan stepped on the cobblestone path and walked along it. However, the more they walked, the more they felt that something was wrong. When they looked at the inner courtyard from the outside, it didn't seem big. It only covered an area of 1 or 2,000 square meters. However, after walking for more than 10 minutes, they still hadn't reached the end. Li Yundong couldn't help but stop and ask curiously, "That's not right. Why is the inner courtyard so big?" Ziyuan looked around and suddenly pulled Li Yundong's arm. She pointed to the side and said, "Li Yundong, look." Li Yundong looked around in the darkness and saw that he was in a zigzag corridor. There were many calligraphy paintings hanging on the wall, and one of them was written with a poem by Su Dongpa. "The eastern sea of clouds is empty, and the immortals appear and disappear. Shaking the world and giving birth to all things, how can there be a palace where a sparrow hides a pearl?" Li Yundong was stunned. "What's wrong with this poem?" Ziyuan said in a deep voice, "When we passed by here before, I noticed that this is the poem hanging here." Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat and he said in a low voice, "You mean, we are trapped here by an illusion?" Ziyuan frowned slightly. She naturally knew that the illusion technique that could trap two masters like them was no trivial matter. She lowered her voice and said, "Li Yundong, why don't you go east and give it a try?" Li Yundong turned his head and saw a wall on the east side. He was stunned and said, "This is a dead end." "How?" Before he could finish his words, he immediately reacted and cast a look of appreciation at Ziyuan. "Good idea." Li Yundong took a slight breath, walked to the wall and pushed it with his palm. With a loud bang, a big hole was opened in the wall and he stepped in. Li Yundong looked around and saw that he was surrounded by a bamboo forest. The scenery was strange. Obviously he had never been here before. Li Yundong laughed and gave Ziyuan a thumbs up. "Let's go, we found the way." The two of them continued to walk along the bamboo path. But after walking for about 10 minutes, Li Yundong and Ziyuan suddenly saw a zigzag corridor in front of them. The entrance was exactly the same as the one they had seen before. Li Yundong and Ziyuan looked at each other, and an ominous feeling rose in their hearts. They quickly rushed inside and saw that there was a wall hanging with Su Dongpa's poem that they had seen before. Li Yundong frowned and said in a low voice, "Damn it, we're really trapped in there. Ziyuan, your cultivation is higher than mine now. Why don't you fly up and have a look?" But not long after, she appeared again. As soon as she saw Li Yundong, she was slightly surprised, but then she calmed down and shook her head. "No, if I fly up there, there will be a fog. I can't see my fingers in front of me and I can't see anything." Li Yundong asked, "How far are you going?" Ziyuan said, "No, I tried just now. I just flew in the direction of Tianan City. At my speed, I would have gone out of Penglai in a few minutes, but when I landed, I still landed beside you." Li Yundong took a deep breath and said, "What a powerful illusion. Who is tricking us? Is it Yu Qing?" Ziyuan turned her head and looked around. Even though she was usually calm, she couldn't help but feel a little flustered at this time. She whispered, "It can't be, right? However, this illusion is really powerful. Could it be that this Penglai immortal realm is going to become the Penglai desperation?" Li Yundong looked around at the dark night and felt that there seemed to be a pair of eyes staring at him in the dark night. Even though Li Yundong's cultivation was high and he was knowledgeable, he couldn't help but feel creepy at this time. There seemed to be an invisible hand pressing down on him, covering the sky and the earth. Chapter 744. It was past 7 o'clock in the evening. Although it was already dark, Penglai Pavilion was shrouded in a dark yellow light. This light was projected from the artificial light on the opposite cliff. Penglai Pavilion, with its ancient city walls and cornices, was shrouded in this slightly cold light. It was faintly discernible, gloomy, and particularly mysterious, gloomy, dignified, and vicissitudes of life. Many tourists who were visiting Penglai Island did not choose to leave. Many people gathered in the distance of Penglai Pavilion and took pictures of this historical scene on their mobile phones or cameras. However, none of them knew that in the depths of this mysterious building, two top cultivators of the younger generation in the cultivation world were trapped in this ancient building complex. A powerful and unknown illusory technique had left them in a terrible state of anxiety and helplessness. Li Yundong had fought with the great Onmyoji Buri, who was proficient in illusion, and had also experienced the power of illusion. The so-called illusion, as the name implied, was the art of illusion. As long as one's willpower was strong and his cultivation was profound, he could not be confused by the illusion. This was the so-called guarding the soul, and no evil could invade. However, when the illusion reached the highest level, it could make the illusion real, trap people in it, and make it difficult for them to escape. Li Yundong took a deep breath in place. He looked around and suppressed a trace of impatience and ominous thoughts in his heart. He said in a low voice, "Let's walk around again. You pay attention to the surroundings and see if there is anything special. It's impossible for such a large-scale illusion to have no flaws. In my opinion, it's better to choose a direction and continue walking. If we find something wrong, we can change direction." Ziyuan nodded and said in a low voice, "Although this method is a little stupid, there is no better way than this now." Li Yundong and Ziyuan carefully changed their direction and broke through the wall as usual. However, after going around for a while, they returned to the zigzag corridor. Li Yundong saw Su Dongpa's poem hanging on the wall and frowned. He immediately turned around and changed his direction, going back the way they had come. However, after walking for a while, they had unknowingly circled back here. Li Yundong and Ziyuan repeated this more than a dozen times. Every time they broke through the wall and went out, they could find that the scenery was different from before. But no matter how they circled around, they would eventually circle back to this corridor. While the two of them were trapped in this powerful illusion maze, Su Chan and Yu Manlu were walking back along the stone road of Penglai Pavilion. Yu Manlu looked at Su Chan, who was walking in front of him, and suddenly said, "Jinren Su, we can go back." At that moment, Su Chan turned her head around, revealing her beautiful face. The neon lights of the night shone on her cheeks, making her look even more beautiful. She suddenly smiled. "Thank God," she said. "Finally I can go back. I thought we were going to circle around here till morning." Yu Manlu's heart was pounding because of the flirtatiousness of Su Chan's smile. He quickly looked away, coughed dryly, calmed down and said, "Jinren Su, you must be joking." Su Chan looked at him curiously and asked, "You're so strange. Why did you call me Jinren? This is the first time I've heard someone call me Sage Su." Yu Manlu said awkwardly, "Then what should I call you?" Su Chan said with a smile, "Su Chan or anything else. It doesn't matter, but you're not allowed to call me Chick or Chaner. Only Yundong can call me that." Yu Manlu touched his nose, feeling a little embarrassed. He didn't know how to reply to Su Chan's words. He thought for a moment and suddenly asked, "Su Chan, I'm very curious. Has anyone ever said that you are a witch?" After he finished speaking, he immediately realized that something was wrong and quickly explained, "I was just curious. I didn't mean to offend you." Su Chan said disapprovingly, "Of course there are. Many cultivators from famous sects have pointed at my nose and called me a witch." As she said this, she turned to look at Yu Manlu and smiled. "Do you think so too?" Yu Manlu quickly waved his hand, but soon he lowered his head awkwardly and said with some embarrassment, "Actually, I thought so at first, but now I think that some rumors may not live up to their name." Su Chan giggled and said, "It's nothing. I just want to be happy with Yundong. I don't care what other people say." Yu Manlu raised his head and suddenly looked at Su Chan with envy. He admired her courage to love and hate. For a moment he put aside his prejudices and began to talk and laugh with Su Chan. They returned along the way. When they reached the depths of the backyard, Su Chan was suddenly stunned. She raised her head and her sinuses moved slightly. "Strange, there seems to be the smell of blood." Yu Manlu stopped and asked curiously, "The smell of blood? I don't smell it. What you smell is the smell of the sea, right? This is the sea, so it's normal to smell this." Su Chan was suspicious in her heart, but after listening to Yu Manlu's explanation, she couldn't help but be a little shaken for a moment. She thought for a moment, put this thought aside for the time being and continued to follow Yu Manlu inside. After walking for a while, Yu Manlu saw a room with a light on. He immediately smiled, pointed to a standing figure in the light and said with a smile, "Over there. Let's go. Do you want to see how my mother repairs powerful magical weapons?" Su Chan's nostrils twitched violently as she walked over. The smell of blood in the air was getting stronger and stronger, and the suspicions in her heart were getting stronger and stronger. But since Yu Manlu had invited her so warmly, Su Chan couldn't refuse. She could only raise her guard and carefully follow behind him. Yu Manlu walked to the house with black tiles and white walls, and knocked on the door with a smile. "Mom, can I come in?" But there was silence in the room. Su Chan suddenly said in a low voice, "Leader, you may be busy. Why don't we come back later?" Yu Manlu turned back and smiled at Su Chan. "No need. Ordinary people can't see how powerful magical weapons are repaired. I was also surprised to see it for the first time. It's okay. Let's go in and have a look." Yu Manlu turned his head to talk to Su Chan as he pushed the door open. But when he turned his head, his eyes suddenly widened, and the pupils in his eyes instantly shrank. In front of him, Yu Qing was leaning against an antique bookshelf, her body motionless. She looked up at the sky, her eyes bulging and her mouth wide open. Dark red blood was slowly flowing out of her mouth, eyes, nose and ears. Her Adam's apple bobbed up and down, making the sound of swallowing blood. Her chest had sunken severely, as if someone had used a large iron hammer to ruthlessly strike it. A sharp and long steel nail was nailed into the Huagai acupoint on her chest where her wound was. Blood dripped from the leg of her Taoist robe, flowing down her feet. The dark red blood slowly spread on the ground, like a ghost, step by step, crawling towards the door. In an instant Yu Manlu and Su Chan's minds went blank. Yu Manlu's mouth was wide open and he was about to let out a scream of horror, but suddenly, a black shadow flashed in the corner of the room with a whoosh. The momentum of this black shadow was extremely ferocious, and all the books and papers in the room were sent flying in all directions. Yu Manlu only saw the black shadow pouncing in front of him in the blink of an eye, and a black palm slapped towards his face. The palm grew larger and larger and in the blink of an eye, it covered his entire vision. Su Chan, who was standing to one side, was already vigilant. Although she was shocked by Yu Qing's tragic situation for a moment, she still reacted very quickly. Without thinking, she immediately reached out and grabbed Yu Manlu, pulling him to her side. Yu Manlu tilted his head. Although the palm did not directly hit his face, it still brushed past his cheek. It was just a brush, but Yu Manlu felt as if his head had been hit by a high-speed train. He was so painful that he was about to let out a scream, but the person's palm suddenly turned and slapped him on the neck. With a crack, Yu Manlu's head tilted and fell on his shoulder. Su Chan, who was standing to one side, suddenly had a fierce look in her eyes. She shouted, and her 5 fingers were like hooks, grabbing at the black shadow in front of her. At this time, Su Chan was already a 7-tailed fox spirit. Her 5 fingers were like hooks, and if this extremely angry claw hit, even steel would be crushed into a ball of flour by her. Seeing the fierce claw, the black shadow retreated in an instant. At this time Yu Manlu's body also fell to the ground with a thud, his whole body twitching. Seeing his current situation, Su Chan hurriedly said, "Jinrenyu, quick, yang spirit out of your body." At this time Yu Manlu was still breathing. With a thought, as soon as the yang spirit came out of his body, he immediately looked around. For a moment he couldn't see the black shadow, so he immediately rushed to Yu Qing like a gust of wind and cried loudly, "Mom, how are you?" "Mom? Oh, who did this to you?" Yu Qing was still breathing. She wanted to lower her head to take another look at her son, but she couldn't move her head. She could only raise her finger slightly and point to a place on the bookshelf beside her. At this time Yu Manlu's eyes were all focused on his mother's chest. He loudly urged Yu Qing to quickly use the yang spirit, so he didn't notice Yu Qing's gesture at all. However, Su Chan, who was standing to one side, saw it at a glance. Following her gesture, she saw a thin, ancient thread-bound book on the bookshelf. She swept to the side of the bookshelf and saw a few small seal characters written on the book. It was the secret method of patching heaven. Su Chan took the book and hurriedly rushed to Yu Qing and asked, "Leader Yu, do you want this?" At this time Yu Qing couldn't speak, nor could she make any expression. Even moving her fingers just now had consumed all her remaining strength. Her throat rolled twice, making 2 strange gurgling sounds, and then she swallowed her last breath. Yu Manlu watched his mother die in front of him. He cried in grief and said loudly, "Mom, why don't you use the yang spirit to go out of your body?" Su Chan tried to persuade him in a low voice, "Leader Yu has a soul-locking nail nailed to her chest. She can't go out of her body even if she wants to." Yu Manlu's eyes turned red. He immediately reached out to grab the soul-locking nail that had penetrated his bones and pulled it out forcefully. With a puff sound, a stream of blood spurted out and splashed on Su Chan. At this time, a golden light slowly surged out of Yu Qing's body and gradually gathered together, forming Yu Qing's original appearance. Yu Manlu was overjoyed. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly saw a black shadow flash and slapped the golden light. Then another palm slapped toward him. The power of this palm was much greater than before. Yu Manlu wanted to turn his yang spirit into countless clones and flee in all directions, but he felt that he was enveloped by the other party's incomparably powerful force, and he couldn't move at all. Even Su Chan, who was standing to one side, had no time to react. She could only watch helplessly as the yang spirits of Yu Manlu and Yu Qing were shattered by the black shadow in an instant. Then, the black shadow took a deep breath, and the glittering golden fragments were sucked into his stomach in one breath and disappeared. Su Chan knew that this time Yu Manlu and Yu Qing were really dead. They didn't even have the chance to be reincarnated. This was no small matter. At this time, the black shadow suddenly turned around, opened its 5 fingers and grabbed the secret method of heaven patching in Su Chan's hand. Chapter 745. Su Chan saw that the black shadow's palm was not as powerful as the previous 2 palms. Obviously, he was worried that if he used too much strength, he would tear the book apart, so he didn't use all his strength. Therefore, she was not shrouded by the gang wind that the other party had exerted with all his strength for a while. Su Chan was quick to react. She hid the secret method of heaven patching in her arms, turned her head and wanted to run away. But as soon as she moved, she felt a gust of gang wind coming from behind. Su Chan gritted her teeth and gathered all her jinchi on her back, ready to take the palm. With a muffled sound, Su Chan felt that the man's palm had hit her back, but the moment it touched her body, the force was reduced by more than half. Even so, she was still sent flying and fell to the ground. Su Chan felt that all the bones in her body were cracking, as if they had been broken by the other party. Her qi and blood were surging, and her blood vessels were like countless fine needles exploding. Her body felt as if it had been struck by lightning, and she was so numb that she couldn't move. The girl gritted her teeth and forced herself to run qi. She quickly turned around and held up an ancient threaded book. She gritted her teeth and activated her jinchi, immediately shredding the book into countless pieces. For a moment, the room was filled with shreds of paper, obscuring everyone's sight. In the previous few exchanges, the other party had come and gone too quickly. Neither the dead Yu Manlu nor the injured Su Chan had been able to see the other party's appearance clearly. At this time, Su Chan looked carefully and saw that the other party was hiding in a dark corner, only revealing a pair of eyes that were as sharp as knives and staring at her. Su Chan looked at the man without showing any weakness. She laughed angrily and said, "I've destroyed the secret method of heaven patching. Kill me. Yun Zhan will avenge me." The black shadow's eyes suddenly became extremely sharp. He moved like a black bolt of lightning. In the blink of an eye, he pounced on Su Chan and slapped down angrily. Su Chan's heart sank and she closed her eyes in despair. She knew that this person's cultivation was too terrifying. At the very least, he was a master of thunder retribution. The most terrifying thing was that his gang wind was extremely fierce, not inferior to Li Yundong's at all. His figure was as fast as lightning, like a ghost. Even if Li Yundong's Jinshin was at its peak, the outcome of the battle would be uncertain, not to mention that Li Yundong was only in the Yangshin phase. Even if Li Yundong and Zi Yuan arrived in time, they would only be courting death. Therefore, Su Chan did not cry for help from beginning to end. She just gritted her teeth and fought. But when she wanted to escape, it was too late. Su Chan closed her eyes tightly, waiting for the man to slap her on the head with the force of Mount Tai. Suddenly she thought, if I die, what will happen to Yun Zhan? The little girl's heart tightened and her body began to tremble uncontrollably. But after waiting for a while, she did not see any movement. Su Chan mustered up her courage and opened her eyes slightly, only to see that there was no one in front of her. The ferocious shadow from before had disappeared. Only Yu Qing's body was in the room, slowly sliding down from one side of the bookshelf and sitting down. At this time, Su Chan quickly rushed to Yu Manlu and Yu Qing. She looked at Yu Qing and then at Yu Manlu. Subconsciously, she wanted to help them, but as soon as she stretched out her hand, she remembered that their yang spirits had been destroyed. Even if their bodies were still alive at this time, they would just be in a vegetative state. Su Chan couldn't bear it. She remembered that Yu Manlu, who had been talking and laughing with her a moment ago, had been destroyed in body and soul. He would never be able to live again. She felt a burst of heartache. The little girl's tears unconsciously fell, but as soon as her tears fell to the ground, she suddenly heard a middle-aged man's voice coming from outside. "Qing Lu, are you there?" As he spoke, the middle-aged man smiled and said to the person beside him, "How did Master Wan know that I would spend the night at school today?" "Aha, no matter what, Master Wan is here today. What a rare guest. I'll ask Qinger to cook a few dishes later. I want to toast Master Wan." When Su Chan heard this voice, her face suddenly changed. Just as she was about to escape, she saw that the 2 people had already appeared at the door. Su Chan turned her head and saw a middle-aged man talking with Wan Jinyuan, the leader of the Gizao sect, with a smile. At this time, Wan Jinyuan had already seen her at a glance, and his eyes suddenly flashed. At this time, the middle-aged man who was turning his head to look at Wan Jinyuan saw that Wan Jinyuan's expression was not right. He turned his head to look into the room and said with a smile, "Qinger look, hook." As he was speaking, he suddenly saw the terrible scene in the room. The smile on his face suddenly froze and his whole body seemed to be frozen. This man was none other than Yu Qing's husband and Yu Manlu's father. The Penglai sect had been passed down to this day, and Yu Qing was the only direct descendant of the sect. Yu Qing herself was a woman. It could be said that if she found a man with another surname, unless the other party married into her family, the bloodline of the leader of the Yu family would be completely severed. However, it was very difficult for a man to marry into her family in Shandong. Even if a man was willing, Yu Qing would not like it. Because of this, after thinking about it, Yu Qing simply found a man who was not a cultivator at all. This man also had the same surname as her, and his name was Yu Tian. He was an honest teacher in Penglai City. Although Yu Qing was not beautiful, she had an outstanding temperament and was overflowing with talent. In the end, she married the unattractive and ordinary Yu Tian, which made the teachers of the school very surprised. Because of this, Yu Tian doted on his wife very much, and Yu Qing also let her son continue to have the surname Yu, which could be considered as taking the edge of the bloodline. After the two young couple with the surname Yu got married, their days were sweet and beautiful. Although Yu Tian did not cultivate himself, under the influence of Yu Qing, he also began to become interested in self-cultivation. After observing for a period of time, Yu Qing simply began to teach her husband the art of cultivation. At this time, the family of three could be considered cultivators. However, Yu Youqian's cultivation was relatively late, and his cultivation was not high. After 10 years of cultivation, he was only at the 5th layer of heaven, the Shintong realm. He was not as powerful as his son, and Yu Tian was not considered a direct disciple of the Penglai sect. He was only a registered disciple. However, Yu Tian was indifferent to fame and fortune, and he did not care about these things at all. After learning to cultivate, he became Taoist companions with his wife, and life became more and more interesting. But he never thought that a sudden disaster would suddenly befall him. His wife died tragically in front of him, and his son was lying in a pool of blood, without any signs of life. A blissful family was shattered in an instant. Yu Youqian's eyes suddenly widened so much that they almost split open. After a moment of shock, he suddenly rushed in front of Yu Qing like a madman, hugged his wife and let out a beast-like roar. This teacher with a pair of black-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose had a ferocious and terrifying face, like that of a devil. Yu Tian glared at Su Chan and roared hysterically, "You're the one who killed Qing'er. You killed Lu." Su Chan was stunned with fear. Her face was pale, and she was about to defend herself when she saw Wang Jinyuan squat down to check Yu Qing and Yu Manlu. He suddenly pointed at her and said sternly, "You witch, why did you come here in the middle of the night? What's the matter with the blood on your body? Their bodies are still warm. It can be seen that you have just committed the murder and haven't had time to escape, right?" Su Chan's head buzzed. She had been pointed at and called a witch many times, but this was the most difficult one for her. She stared at Wang Jinyuan with her eyes wide open, only to see a sinister smile on the corner of his mouth. Her heart shook and a thought flashed through her mind like lightning. "No, this is a trap." Su Chan jumped up in fright and quickly explained, "No, I didn't kill them. It was someone else." Wang Jinyuan said sternly, "Someone else? Where is he? We didn't see anyone along the way just now." Look at Yu Qing and Yu Manlu's posture, and then look at the scene. It's obvious that an acquaintance did it, and they didn't resist at all. Su Chan was shocked and angry. "I didn't. It's also my first time here." Wang Jinyuan immediately said aggressively, "Is this your first time here? Why are you here?" Su Chan subconsciously wanted to blurt out Li Yundong's name, but when the words were about to come out of her mouth, she immediately swallowed them back. Her heart was tight. She knew that this must be a trap. If she told Li Yundong and Zi Yuan, they would definitely be implicated. Su Chan immediately swallowed her words and said loudly, "I didn't kill them. Whether you believe it or not, I didn't kill them." At this time Yu Tian roared sternly, "Then who is it? Tell me, tell me." Su Chan was speechless for a moment. She closed her mouth tightly and stopped talking. She looked left and right, trying to find a way to escape. Yu Tian had been misled by Wang Jinyuan and had long regarded Su Chan as a murderer. At this time, when he saw Su Chan like this, he was even more certain that she was the murderer. Yu Tian let out a roar and lunged at Su Chan like a madman. He had cultivated for 10 years, and although his cultivation level was not high, he was furious. He gnashed his teeth so hard that blood seeped out of the corners of his eyes. His teeth creaked, and his gums bit so hard that his mouth was full of blood. Yu Tian chased after Su Chan like a mad tiger and attacked her fiercely. Su Chan couldn't fight back, so she was chased around by Yu Tian. At this time, a shout suddenly came from not far away, "Chaner, where are you?" Su Chan was shocked. She could tell that it was Li Yundong's voice, but she didn't dare to answer. She moved and quickly rushed in Li Yundong's direction. At this time, Wang Jinyuan grabbed Yu Tian, who was about to chase after her, and said anxiously, "Jinrenyu, calm down." Yu Tian roared like a madman, "Let me go. I'm going to kill her and avenge my wife and son." Wang Jinyuan said quickly, "Jinrenyu, do you know who is standing behind this demoness? It's super battler Li Wudi. You're no match for him and I'm no match for him either. As long as there's life, there's hope. Let's hurry up and leave. Don't be silenced." Yu Yotian's eyes were as fierce as those of a demon. The blue veins at the corners of his eyes bulged, and he gritted his teeth so hard that they almost broke. His whole body trembled violently, and his chest rose and fell a few times. He turned his head heavily and quickly fled into the distance. Wang Jinyuan turned his head and glanced at Li Yunyang, who was rushing over. He chuckled and chased after Yu Tian. Yu Tian ran until he had almost used up all of his Zhenyuan and strength. Only then did he stop. He looked around and found himself in a desolate mountain range. The bright moon in the sky looked down at him coldly. It was a dark and windy night, silent and gloomy. Yu Tian thought of his dead wife and son. For a moment he was so sad that he couldn't help crying. Wang Jinyuan, who had rushed over, did not fan the flames. He just quietly accompanied him. At this time his goal had been achieved. He calmed down and thought of Yu Qing's tragic situation. Wang Jinyuan couldn't help but sigh softly. He patted Yu Tian on the shoulder and said in a deep voice, "Jinrenyu, death is like a lamp going out. Get over it." Yu Tian suddenly turned his head and said, "Get over it? How can I get over it? Tell me. Who is this Li Wudi? What's his relationship with the murderer?" Wang Jinyuan sighed softly and said, "Jinrenyu, to be honest, Super Li is the most powerful person in the cultivation world today. Even I, the leader of the Gizao sect, don't dare to provoke him." You are still?" Yu Tian bellowed in rage. What did you say? Is it true that only those with big fists can live in this world? Is there no justice in this world? I don't believe that there is no justice in this world. I don't believe that no one in this world can help me take revenge." As he spoke, Yu Yotian's whole body trembled. He clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles cracked, and the black hair on his head stood up. He raised his head to the sky, like an extremely angry beast, and roared carefully, "If I don't take revenge, I swear I'm not a human being." Well, some readers enthusiastically pointed out the bug that Ziyuan couldn't speak Japanese. In fact, you might as well go back and read chapter 495. There is a chapter about the Taoist assembly that says, "The three Japanese were whispering." Ziyuan, who was beside them, heard their words and couldn't help looking at them again and frowning. Li Yundong was keenly aware of her strangeness, so he asked, "Ziyuan, what's wrong?" Ziyuan thought for a moment and said to Li Yundong in a low voice, "It's nothing. These Japanese look down on us cultivators." From this paragraph, it can be seen that Ziyuan actually understood Japanese. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to understand what these Japanese were saying. The reason why she didn't tell Li Yundong was that she was afraid that he would be impulsive and cause trouble. This paragraph is actually a very secret setting that I buried at the beginning, but I didn't write it clearly at the beginning. In my setting, Ziyuan is actually very proficient in Japanese. At the Taoist assembly, I already had a clear setting in my heart. However, maybe because the time span is too long and the length is too long, I really don't remember whether there is a paragraph that Ziyuan doesn't understand Japanese. If there is, please point it out. It should be my negligence. I will go back and change it. After all, this book has been written for almost a year. It's normal for some things to be wrong. I welcome readers to point out this kind of bug. Of course, if there is no bug, then the part about Ziyuan being proficient in Japanese should not be a bug. There was a very hidden explanation before. But it doesn't matter. I have always changed this kind of thing. I welcome everyone to point out my mistakes. I just need to pay a little attention to my words. Chapter 746. Li Yundong and Ziyuan, who were trapped in the illusion, had no idea that a terrible disaster was about to befall them. When the two of them turned to the zigzag corridor for the nth time, Li Yundong finally couldn't help sighing and saying, "Well, I admit defeat. This illusion maze is too powerful. Who put it here? Why did this person want to trap us here?" Ziyuan frowned tightly. She looked around and pondered for a moment before saying, The most powerful illusions in the world are the Maoshan sect of China and the Yin-Yang sect of Japan. In addition, the illusions of Xingyi school and Xingyan Tantrism are also very powerful, but I remember that there is a sect that seems to be famous for its illusions and charm. As Ziyuan said this, she couldn't help but look at Li Yundong. She didn't tell the truth, but Li Yundong could hear the underlying meaning in her words. A sect famous for its illusions and charm? Who else could it be but the Fox Zen school? Li Yundong's expression was strange for a moment, and he couldn't help muttering in a low voice, "No way? No one from the Fox Zen school would make things difficult for us at this time, right? Could it be Ao Wushuang?" While he was thinking, his eyes suddenly swept around and once again fell on Su Dongpa's poem. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat and he said in a low voice, "Every illusion has a flaw, and every maze has a formation eye." We walked around and saw countless calligraphy treasures along the way. We passed this corridor countless times. Ziyuan, why do you think this calligraphy treasure is always hanging here but it is always hanging steadily? Ziyuan's heart suddenly skipped a beat. She stared at the calligraphy treasure with her eyes wide open, only to see that because they had broken through the walls in all directions of the zigzag corridor, many of the calligraphy treasures had been shaken to the side, but this one had been hanging straight and stable. Ziyuan's eyes lit up. "Yes, you are so smart. This must be the flaw of the formation eye. Come on, try it." Li Yundong's heart shook, and he quickly walked to the hanging calligraphy. Just as he was about to push it hard, he suddenly found that the air around him suddenly twisted, and the zigzag corridor in front of him and the calligraphy with Su Dongpa's poem suddenly disappeared. Li Yundong and Ziyuan looked around in surprise, only to find that they were in front of an empty jungle. There was a solid bluestone floor under their feet. Not far away there were towering trees and a little further away, there was the dark sea hidden in the night. Li Yundong smiled bitterly. "What the hell is this place? How did we get here?" Ziyuan let out a sigh of relief and said, "It seems that the magic formation suddenly disappeared by itself? No matter what, we can finally taste it." Li Yundong thought for a moment and asked Ziyuan with some reluctance, "Ziyuan, do you think this piece of calligraphy just now is the flaw in the formation eye?" Ziyuan looked at him and suddenly said with a smile, "I don't know. Why don't you ask the person who cast this magic to lock you in again and try again?" Li Yundong shook his head and said with a wry smile, "Forget it. If I go in again the world will be different. Do you think I'm stupid?" Ziyuan turned her head in the direction of Penglai Pavilion and said, "We don't know how we got here. Let's go back quickly. Su-chan and leader, you should be waiting anxiously." Li Yundong nodded. "Well, let's go." As soon as he finished speaking, he heard a roar suddenly ring out. It was in the direction where they had met Yuqing before. Li Yundong and Ziyuan looked at each other, and an ominous thought emerged in their hearts at the same time. Ziyuan knew that her cultivation was higher than Li Yundong's at this time, so she didn't want Li Yundong to rush in front. She moved and immediately rushed in the direction of the sound. Li Yundong followed behind her, shouting as he ran, "Chaner!" His shout spread far away, as if it was going to cross the sea and reach the distant sky. But after he shouted, there was no response from Su-chan. Li Yundong's heart sank, and his face became more and more unsightly. He sped up a little. The two of them moved as fast as lightning. In a few leaps, they arrived at the place where they had been waiting for Yuqing. Just as they were about to continue running inside, they suddenly saw a figure bump into them. Li Yundong's eyes narrowed. Just by looking at the outline of the figure, he recognized that it was Su-chan. He was overjoyed and shouted, "Chaner? I'm here." Only then did Su-chan suddenly stop, turn her head, and look at Li Yundong in shock. Her eyes were wide open, full of fear and panic as well as the grievance and anger of being wronged. Li Yundong saw that her face was covered in blood and couldn't help but turn pale with fright. He quickly grabbed her hands and explored her body with his jinchi. "What's wrong with you? Where are you hurt? Who hurt you?" Su-chan's body trembled violently. She pulled Li Yundong with both hands, but her eyes looked at Ziyuan. She said anxiously, "Yundong, sister Ziyuan, let's go. Someone framed us." Li Yundong's jinchi quickly explored Su-chan's body and found that she was indeed not injured. Only then did he feel a little relieved. He held Su-chan's shoulders with both hands and said in a deep voice, "Chaner, don't worry. What happened?" Su-chan's pretty face was pale, and she said anxiously, "Someone killed Yuqing and Yu Manlu and wants to frame me." "What?" Li Yundong and Ziyuan were shocked at the same time. Ziyuan took a step forward and said in a shocked voice, "Leader Yu is dead? How did he die? Who did it?" Li Yundong immediately asked in shock, "Someone framed you? Who?" Su Chan quickly shook her head and said, I don't know. I couldn't see his figure. I only know that this person is very powerful. I didn't even have the strength to resist his palm. As she said this, Su Chan pulled Li Yundong's arm and urged him anxiously, Yundong, leave quickly. I'm now considered a murderer, but if you are seen by others, you will also be considered an accomplice. Li Yundong raised his eyebrows and said angrily, Nonsense. I'm not afraid of a crooked shadow. I didn't do it, so why should I be afraid of others framing me? Su Chan stamped her feet and said anxiously, Yundong. Rumors are a fearful thing. The most terrible thing in the world is not framing with evidence but framing out of thin air. Someone wants to harm us. How can you jump into a trap? Li Yundong raised his eyebrows and was about to speak when Ziyuan suddenly asked, Su Chan, who else was there when you left? Su Chan turned her face and saw that although Ziyuan's fists were clenched tightly, her face was still calm. Her eyes were shining with calmness and wisdom, which gradually calmed Su Chan down. Su Chan said quickly, at that time, a middle-aged man wearing glasses rushed in. He seemed to be Yu Qing's husband and Yu Youtian's father. The other person was Wang Jinyuan, the leader of the Gizao sect. He insisted that I was the murderer, so Yu Youtian also believed it and wanted to kill me like crazy. Li Yundong was so angry that he laughed. Wang Jinyuan? Good. This guy finally showed up again. Very good. It seems that he has cultivated to the Jinshan phase. I want to see how much his cultivation has improved one day. How dare he slander me like this? Ziyuan knew that Su Chan was Li Yundong's weakness. As long as it was related to Su Chan, Li Yundong would not be able to deal with it calmly. She couldn't help but persuade him, Li Yundong, calm down. The whole thing is very strange. How could it be possible that as soon as we arrived, someone cast an illusion spell on us and then Yu Qing was killed? And Su Chan happened to be there. Was she framed by this guy? Also, think about it, why did Wang Jinyuan come at this time? Why did he insist that Su Chan was the murderer as soon as he came? Hearing this, Li Yundong gradually calmed down. He turned his head and said to Su Chan, Chaner, don't be afraid. With me here the sky won't fall. I will definitely clear your name. Let's go to the scene and have a look. Maybe we can find something. It's not a good idea for you to just run away like this. Wouldn't it be a good thing for the other party to say that we have a guilty conscience? Su Chan sighed and said, but if we go there and are seen by others, they will say that we are going to destroy the corpses. Li Yundong sneered and said, no matter what, it's still a knife to the head. It's better to go straight forward. Let's go and have a look together. Seeing that she couldn't persuade Li Yundong, Su Chan could only sigh softly and nod. She gently held Li Yundong's hand and nervously and carefully followed behind him. After they arrived at the scene of the murder, Ziyuan quickly stepped forward. She glanced at Yu Qing and then at Yu Manlu. She suddenly took a deep breath and said, what a domineering strength. He actually broke the neck of a Yang spirit master with one palm. It's terrible. Li Yundong looked at the blood on the ground and his eyes fell on Yu Qing's face, which had died with a grievance. His heart was heavy and he felt indescribably uncomfortable. At this time, Su Chan suddenly took Li Yundong's hand and whispered, by the way, Yundong, the murderer who killed Yu Qing and Yu Manlu also wanted to steal the Penglai sect's secret method of mend heaven. Li Yundong was stunned and asked, the secret method of mend heaven? Is it the ancient book that records the secret method of repairing powerful magical weapons? Where did the murderer see this book? Could it be that the book was in this room at that time? Su Chan said softly, at that time, leader Yu Qing was hit by the murderer, but she didn't die for a while. She pointed at the bookshelf with her finger, and I looked in the direction of her finger so I found the secret method of mend heaven. Later the murderer wanted to steal it so I tore the book into pieces. Li Yundong was silent for a long time. He looked at Ziyuan and said in a low voice, it seems that the other party is here to steal the secret method of mend heaven? Ziyuan pondered for a while and nodded slowly. That's possible. Li Yundong sighed and said, an ordinary man is innocent, but he gets into trouble because of his wealth. As he said this, Li Yundong leaned over Yu Qing and reached out to gently brush her face, closing her eyes. He let out a long sigh and said, alas, such a tragedy happened under my nose. It's really, alas. Ziyuan lowered her eyes, which were full of grief and regret. She sighed softly and said, the direct bloodline of the Penglai sect, which has been passed down in the cultivation world for nearly 2,000 years, has been severed. The secret method of mend heaven has also been lost. It's sad. The two of them sighed and Su Chan suddenly whispered, the secret method of mend heaven has not been lost. Li Yundong and Zi Yuan were stunned at the same time. Li Yundong turned his head and said involuntarily, "What did you say?" Su Chan carefully took out a thread-bound book from her arms and held it up with both hands. Li Yundong and Zi Yuan looked at it and saw that there were 4 small seal characters written on the blue thread-bound book. It was the secret method of mend heaven. It was the 3rd night today, and the 2nd night was at the 3rd night. It could be considered as making up for the lack of updates when I went to Beijing. Chapter 747. Li Yundong looked at the blue thread-bound book that could be found everywhere in street bookstores in surprise. Is this the secret method of patching heaven, which records the secret technique of repairing powerful magical weapons? Didn't you say that you had destroyed this book? At this time, Su Chan's eyes showed the unique slyness of a fox spirit. I was hit on the back by the murderer. At that time, I turned around in pain and happened to fall next to the bookshelf, so I took a book at random while my back was facing him. Anyway, many of the books on this bookshelf are blue thread-bound books, and they are all about the same thickness. My back is facing up, so no one can tell that it is not this one. When the murderer saw that I had destroyed this book, he ran away. At that time, I thought he would kill me, but I didn't expect that he would let me go. Yu Manlu had been hit by the murderer, and his neck had been forcibly broken. Although the back could withstand more blows than the neck, Su Chan was a woman, and there were many vital acupoints on the back far from the chest, and there was also the pivot of the spine. If these areas were injured, the person would be crippled. Therefore, whether it was fighting or fighting, there was a saying that it is better to be punched in the chest than to be slapped in the back. When Li Yundong heard that Su Chan had been slapped, he couldn't stand still. He quickly went forward to check Su Chan's back and asked repeatedly, "You were slapped? Why didn't you tell me just now?" Su Chan wrinkled her nose slightly at Li Yundong, revealing a charming and cute expression. She smiled slightly and said, "Don't worry, the murderer didn't seem to want to hurt me. When he hit me, his strength was reduced by more than half, so I didn't suffer any injuries. I made you worry." Li Yundong was relieved, but he quickly frowned again. "You said that this person's strength was reduced by more than half when he hit you? Why is that?" As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately reacted and answered his own question. "Did he deliberately leave you here so that Wang Jinyuan could frame you?" At this time Zi Yuan said, "It's very likely. Looking at the whole thing from the beginning to the end, every thread was connected and everything happened at the right time. Yu Qing went to the backyard and asked us to wait there. When we went to look for her, we happened to be trapped in the illusion formation. We've been trapped in the maze for a while now. If the murderer wanted to kill someone, I'm afraid that even 10 Yu Qings would be dead. However, the murderer waited for Su Chan and Yu Manlu to come back before he made his move. This means that the murderer was clearly waiting for someone to frame him. Moreover, as soon as he succeeded, our illusion maze immediately disappeared, and Wang Jinyuan just happened to appear. If so many coincidences only appear once, it means that it is just a coincidence. But if so many coincidences are gathered together, then it must be a man-made conspiracy." Li Yundong nodded and said in a deep voice, "Yes. I know what you're saying, but what I'm most worried about is not being framed, but, is this murderer here to steal the secret method of heaven patching or to frame us?" Li Yundong's words seemed to be just ordinary reasoning, but when they looked at it, there was a conspiracy that was enough to make their hair stand on end. Zi Yuan knew that if it was the former, then why didn't the murderer kill Su Chan? If it was just to steal the secret method of heaven patching, would there be a need to frame her? Only someone who specialized in framing others would deliberately let Su Chan go. If it was the latter, then the question was, how did the murderer know that they were going to Peng Lai Pavilion? Li Yundong and Zi Yuan looked at each other, and both of them showed a touch of shock in each other's eyes. There is a traitor in the Fox Zen school? No way. Li Yundong took a deep breath. A pungent smell of blood drilled into his sinuses and went deep into his lungs, making him feel a burning sensation in his chest and a little hot. At this time, Su Chan also lowered her head, her eyes flickering. No one knew what she was thinking. Li Yundong looked around and said decisively in a deep voice, "Let's go. We've seen the scene, so there's no need to stay any longer. Let's go back first." The 3 of them nodded, rose up and flew back to Tianan City. After returning home, Su Chan subconsciously wanted to go to her own house, but Li Yundong stopped her. He pointed to Zi Yuan's house across the street and said, "Here." Su Chan was also a very smart person. She knew that most of the little foxes were gathered in the living room watching TV at this time, and Li Yundong didn't want to disturb them. She nodded and followed Li Yundong into Zi Yuan's house quietly. Although it was across the street, Ziyuan's house was much quieter than Li Yundong's. The little foxes liked to be lively, and Li Yundong's house was bustling all day long, so the little foxes liked to gather there. For a moment, Ziyuan's house seemed extremely empty. After Li Yundong and the others entered Ziyuan's room and closed the door, Li Yundong sighed and put the secret method of heaven patching on the table. He shook his head and said, "If this murderer came for me, then it can be said that I killed leader Yu Qingyu." Ziyuan comforted him softly, "Li Yundong, you're wrong to say that. If that's the case, it's me who killed leader Yu and Yu Manlu. If you hadn't wanted to repair my powerful magical weapon, leader Yu's family wouldn't have suffered such a tragedy." Li Yundong sighed bitterly. "That's not what you said. If you hadn't wanted to go through the divine tribulation for me, your powerful magical weapon wouldn't have been damaged." As they spoke, the two of them fell silent. After a long time, Li Yundong sighed and said, "Maybe this is fate." Ziyuan looked sad and lowered her head in silence. Li Yundong rarely saw her blaming herself like this, so he took the initiative to smile and said, "Everyone has their own fate. You don't have to be sad. Fortunately, the secret method of heaven patching has been preserved completely. The unique skills of the Penglai sect have not been lost. In the future, if we can resolve this misunderstanding with Sect Master Yu's husband, we can return this secret manual to them. That way we can return it to them intact." Ziyuan sighed softly. "That's the only way. I hope that leader Yu's partner won't be blinded by hatred." Li Yundong gritted his teeth and said, "If I find out who the murderer is, I won't let him off." Su Chan, who was standing to one side, couldn't help but think of Yu Youqian's ferocious appearance. For a moment she shivered. She didn't think much of it, but seeing that Li Yundong and Ziyuan were both blaming themselves, she didn't say anything. At this time, after the three of them left, Yu Yutian and Wan Jinyuan returned to the backyard of Penglai Pavilion after a long time. When Yu Yutian returned home, he saw that his wife and son were still lying in a pool of blood. The two of them, who had been alive and smiling yesterday, had now turned into cold corpses. He couldn't help but feel sad and burst into tears. His cry was so desolate that even Wan Jinyuan felt sad when he heard it. He couldn't help but persuade him, "Jinrenyu, don't cry. Death is like an extinguished lamp. If sect leader Yu and Yu Manlu knew about this, they would definitely not want to see you like this." Yu Yutian cried, "Their young spirits have been crushed. How can they still have souls in heaven? Killing people is just a matter of nodding their heads. How much hatred does this person have for our Yu family that he would do such a cruel thing? Why didn't he kill me too?" Wan Jinyuan didn't say anything. He thought to himself, who asked the Yu family to have such a heaven-defying skill as repairing powerful magical weapons, but you don't have a strong self-protection skill? Seeing that Yu Yutian had cried for a long time, Wan Jinyuan tried to persuade him again, "Jinrenyu, let's rest in peace. Don't let leader Yu and Yu Manlu lie like this." Although Yu Yutian had become a monk halfway, after more than 10 years of nurturing, he had developed the habit of thinking of cultivators. The matters of the cultivation world should be handled in the cultivation world. He had made up his mind to take revenge, so he had no intention of calling the police. After crying bitterly for a while, he cremated his wife and son with magic and then put them in a blue and white porcelain jar. Holding the jar, he wiped his tears and said through gritted teeth, "I don't believe that there is no one in the cultivation world who can uphold justice for me." Wan Jinyuan patted his chest and said with a righteous look, "Well, Jinrenyu, I'll accompany you in this lawsuit. I'll definitely testify for you when the time comes." Yu Youqian's eyes were full of gratitude. "Master Wan, I can't thank you enough. When the day comes when my wife and son's death is avenged, I'll definitely repay you well." Wan Jinyuan pretended to smile heroically. "Hey Jinrenyu, what are you talking about? All the cultivators in the world are a family. Besides, it's our duty to help when we see injustice, let alone say a few words of justice." Yu Yutian bowed respectfully to Wan Jinyuan, then went down the mountain with the urn. He had encountered such a big change that he didn't even have time to go to school to ask for leave. He turned around and wanted to find someone to seek justice. But in today's cultivation world, who could seek justice for him? In Yu Youqian's opinion, the Jingyi school, the most powerful sect in the cultivation world, could undoubtedly uphold justice and uphold justice. If they didn't go to Mount Longhu, where else could they go? Therefore Yu Yutian and Wan Jinyuan went straight to Mount Longhu. But when he heard that they were going to Mount Longhu, Wan Jinyuan wanted to retreat. The reason was very simple. The current leader of the Jingyi school was Zhang Ling, the Lady of the Earthly Fire. Wan Jinyuan had experienced the power of this woman many times. Although his current cultivation was far higher than hers, Wang Jinyuan was still a little afraid. This kind of thing wasn't something that could be justified just because one's cultivation was higher. As the saying goes, if you are reasonable you can go anywhere in the world. If you are unreasonable you can't do anything. This was a universal truth in the cultivation world. When the Japanese came to our country to make trouble, they had also tried hard to find all kinds of excuses. They just wanted to find a good reason for themselves. Although Zhang Ling was overbearing and arrogant, she was not a fool. This woman was very smart. Although sometimes she was a little blinded by the fact that she was biased, most of the time she was definitely not easy to deal with. With Zhang Ling's suspicious nature and sharp tongue, if he had followed Yu Tian up the mountain and been interrogated by her, he was afraid that even if there were no loopholes, he would still be able to find some loopholes. Furthermore, this matter was originally framed. In this case it was better to let Yu Tian go alone. Although he had mistakenly identified the murderer, his grief and indignation were not fake. Even if Zhang Ling wanted to ask some sharp questions, she was afraid that he, who had lost his wife and son, would not be able to say some sharp words. Moreover, he was the leader of the external alchemy. Even if he met Celestial Master Zhang, he would be on the same level as him. If he went to find Zhang Ling like this, it would be too degrading and embarrassing. After accompanying Yu Tian to the foot of Mount Longhu, Wang Jinyuan said to him, "Jinrenyu, I can only take you up to here. After all, this is Mount Longhu. If I go up, it will be very inconvenient and may cause you some trouble." Yu Tian didn't know what Wang Jinyuan was thinking, but he thought that Wang Jinyuan was worried about the battle between the Naiden sect and the external alchemy and didn't want to cause trouble for himself. He said to Wang Jinyuan gratefully, "Master Wan, I will remember your righteousness. You have already done your best to accompany me here. Master Wan, please rest assured. I will go up the mountain alone." After that, he went up the mountain with the urn in his hands. Although it was early in the morning, there were still many devout pilgrims who came early to offer incense. These pilgrims saw Yu Tian holding an urn and kneeling in front of the gate of Mount Longhu, crying loudly, "This is injustice." These pilgrims were shocked. Oh my God, where did this lunatic come from? Why did he come to Mount Longhu to complain? Did he take the wrong medicine? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.